Let's wait for people to stroll on in. I might just put music on again.
Louisa. Louisa.
What's good? What's good, y'all? Can you hear me? Let me know. Press 1 in the chat if you can hear me loud and clear. Does anybody hear me? What's good, Trigger Happy? Got you. Sorry about that, y'all. I had some technical difficulties on the first go around. I was speaking off the top of my lungs and nobody could hear me. But we're going to go ahead and get started again. This is going to be a history of West Africa, and this is going to be a chronological synopsis of West African civilizations. So the reason why I wanted to have this conversation is because, in my years coming up, I always heard this commentary about why there wasn't the same amount of attention to West African civilizations as there were to other civilizations on the African continent. And little did I know that most of the information that was published about West African history was not in English, because you had many of these different nations like Burkina Faso, like Mali, like Senegal, like Cote d'Ivoire, who were French-speaking nations. So some of the greatest scholars of those nations who are publishing the histories of their people in French or their indigenous language wouldn't necessarily be available to everybody here in the United States, who's mainly English-speaking. So that was one big issue that I found coming up, was the language barrier between, West African civilizations or West African people who are primarily French and indigenous African language speakers, as opposed to, those of us in North America who solely speak English. Was good, Zuchetto? Yeah, I'm glad y'all could hear me. I appreciate that. Was good, Cujo? We're about to get it in. So let's just get started. So when we're understanding the history of West African civilizations, we have to start with the particular material cultures because not all the material cultures in West Africa are the same. The first one that you have is the Acheulean culture, and this is dated from about 1.76 million years ago to about 130,000 years ago. This mainly consisted of hand axes, cleavers, and flakes, and it was primarily used by these Homo erectus and archaic Homo sapiens. And the West African populations who used this culture are primarily derived from the Odovi populations in Tanzania. Next, after the early Stone Age, you have the Middle Stone Age populations, and this is mainly characterized by the Lupemban and the Tyrian cultures in Western Africa. So this Middle Stone Age culture dominated Western North Africa as late as 24,000 years ago. And these cultures were predominantly made of archaic humans. That's these early Homo sapiens. And there's not necessarily material continuity with these late Stone Age foragers that come after the Middle Stone Age people and these Lupemban and Tyrian cultures that we're describing here. So when we look back and we go back to the Odovi Gorge in Tanzania, and that is essentially where some of the oldest Stone Age cultures originate from. And you can compare that to West African populations. You're looking at, Odovi populations coming from, 1.76 million years ago in Eastern Africa, and then descending into Western Africa about 780,000 years ago. And you're going to see the same type of pattern if you look at the Middle Stone Age. The Middle Stone Age also originates in Eastern Africa and then comes into West Africa, primarily from the Nile to the different waterways that existed within the ancient Sahara and the ancient Sahel. So in the area of Gadi Mode, Ethiopia, that's where you see the first Middle Stone Age cultures about 280 or so thousand years ago. And then in West Africa, the first Middle Stone Age cultures are going to be in the Unguju area of Mali, where you find the first pottery about 71,000 years ago. So again, when you're looking at the early Stone Age and the Middle Stone Age, things are starting in East Africa before going into West Africa. When you move on to what particular cultures existed within the Middle Stone Age, you have the Lupemban industry. And this industry is important because there's a lot of variability in the transition from the Middle Stone Age to the Late Stone Age, in the sense that you kind of see these archaic humans associating and mixing in with Late Stone Age populations. An example of that in Western Africa is the Iwu Aleru man. So these Lupemban cultures, these are fairly small, well-shaped tools, chisels, adzes, planes, side scrapers, and blades. The most common tool is an elongate lancelet bifacial point that is very finely flaked. And you can see that in some of these descriptions here. And this is primarily dated to about 300,000 years ago. So these are some of the oldest Lupemban cultures. And again, when we're talking about the Middle Stone Age, the Middle Stone Age doesn't reach Africa until about 71,000 years ago. Then you have the Aterian cultures. So these are late Pleistocenic cultures, that's before 11.6 thousand years ago, that produce large flakes from a tortoise core. And it's a distinctive Aterian sign is a formation of stems or tangs on tools to facilitate hafting. So this was done on spearheads, arrowheads, and scrapers. And bifacial spearheads were also produced. And these Aterian cultures in West Africa are dated to about 150,000 years ago. So when we're dealing with these Middle Stone Age cultures, we're primarily talking about archaic humans. We're not talking about modern Homo sapiens like those of us who are on this stream. So then we're going to go to the Late Stone Age cultures. So the Late Stone Age cultures are the material cultures of West Africa that came after the early Stone Age and the Middle Stone Age. These cultures are what we would call Homo sapiens, our species, and they're represented primarily by foragers. These are basically people who gather food in the wild and eat it. They don't necessarily domesticate it. They're related to the Shumlaka culture of foragers 32,000 years ago in Western Cameroon. And when you're looking at the Late Stone Age, you're looking at the origin of modern humans, modern Homo sapiens. And some of the oldest examples that we have of this is about 70,000 years ago in the Great Rift system, in the western portion of the Great Rift system in Ethiopia. And Eastern Africa. So that's really, really fascinating because at the time that the Middle Stone Age reaches West Africa from Eastern Africa, Homo sapiens sapiens are beginning to manifest in the western portion of the Great Rift System of Eastern Africa. So it's interesting how you see that same directionality from the Middle Stone Age to the Late Stone Age, right? So this would eventually reach Western Cameroon about 32,000 years ago, represented by the Shumlaka culture. And then it's noted in Western Africa about 15,000 years ago in Senegal. So the majority of the languages and cultures of these foragers, of these late Stone Age Homo sapiens sapien foragers, or diminutive populations have been lost. And they were assimilated into incoming agropastoralists from the north and the east about 4 to 1.5 thousand years ago. So now we're talking about the addition of modern West Africans into the region that we now know as West Africa. So a lot of African populations actually have traditions of these early late Stone Age foragers. They actually have migratory histories where they detail that the local people in the lands that they're inhabiting were there before them. These are the ancient populations of these regions. So according to the Dogon, the Yeban and the Andumbu in the Bandiagara area came first. The Telem came next around the 11th century, and then the Dogon came around the 16th century. So the Mande and the Dogon, or the Kador, revere the proprietary rights of the ancients in their modern rituals. So within their theological practices, many West Africans, such as the Dogon and Mande, identify that they are not the original inhabitants of that land, and they revere the original inhabitants by paying respect to them in some of their ritual ceremonies. So moving on, you have the Soninke, who called the 4th century immediate predecessors of the Ouagadougou culture, the Goloma, and refer to the collective groups related to the ancient Dartichic culture as the Kokolo. So that's very, very important because according to the Soninke, right, they are not the creators of the Tichic culture, one of the first cultures that produced settlements in Western Africa, what some people would relate to a civilization, even though it doesn't necessarily meet the mark of a modern civilization in the technical sense. They say that they are not the founders of the Tichic culture. It's the Kakolo people. And they also say that there are people who came after the Kakolo called the Goloma in the early part of the Common Era. So again, the Soninke, according to their own traditions, do not identify a material continuity between the Tichic culture and modern Ghana. Then you have the Bozo and the Sakara fishermen, which are Mande groups considered the current and oldest speakers in the Niger region. And they speak about short red men who existed before them. So some of the oldest groups on the Oya River Valley or the Niger River Valley articulate that they are not the original people of that land, and that diminutive red-skinned man, like red-brown-skinned man, like these two children that we see on the right, existed there before them. That's very, very fascinating. So we have names within various Western African nations of these previous people, these late Stone Age foragers who existed in those regions before them. The Malinke of Mali, they call them the Woklo. The Sosu of Guinea, they call them Doki. The Wolof of Senegal, Kondrong. The Mosi of Burkina Faso call them Kinkirsi. The Songhai of Niger call them Arakurma. The Gurma people of Burkina Faso call them Apola. And the Kurumba of the Burkina Faso and Ghana area called them Ajijia. So it's very fascinating that there are populations in Western African history, in the oral traditions of West Africa, and the people, the modern West African populations who migrated into the region have identified these people within their culture and within their traditions. And they even have names that they called these people, as I'm sure some of them were intermingling and relating with each other. So if we look at the traditions, it's very, very clear that most modern West Africans do not identify themselves as the original inhabitants of the land. So again, moving on, you in Liberia, they call them Jina, the many people of Liberia. And linguistic analysis shows that the Ja'ala language of Nigeria may reflect these prehistoric diminutive populations because it is a language isolate, right? So they can't relate it to any of the modern languages of West Africa. Most linguists believe that those late Stone Age foragers, their language was completely lost to history. So these language isolates that they can detect within Western Africa can literally be a reference, especially when they're among these diminutive populations of these late Stone Age forager cultures. And we have to reiterate that there's not necessarily genetic continuity or material continuity between these late Stone Age foragers in West Africa and modern West African populations. So what you have here is this is some geoclimatic data. You have the Ogolian hyperarea, which was about from 20 to 12,000 years ago. And the majority of West Africa during this time period was uninhabited. So you don't have material continuity, demographic continuity through different periods of time in West Africa due to the geological conditions, right? Because of the geological conditions, because of the aridation of the Sahara, prior to the onset of the human period, the majority of West Africa was uninhabited. And many of these Africans retreated to coastal refugia in the lower West African coast, as well as North Africa, along with the Nile Valley. So would these be various eponyms with the Twa people? And I'm mostly using placeholders because IDK, what's the right name to call them since pygmy definitely is no good? Yeah, I would say absolutely, absolutely. If we go back and we look at these terms, these are terms within West African languages that they're identifying these hunter-gatherers or these foragers who would be related to the Twa within the classical Remen-Kimi text. So yes, I would say absolutely. So moving on, then you have the African humid period, which is about from 14 to 5,000 years ago. And this is primarily people from terminal Pleistocenic, which is pre-11.6 thousand years ago, Nile Valley populations, along with coastal refugia from North Africa and the West African coast. So when you're looking at the African humid period from 14 to 5,000 years ago, you see people coming in from North Africa, people coming in from the lower West African coast, and then predominant populations coming from the Nile Valley. And this is most typified by the Kifian and Tenerian cultures of Gobero in Niger, right? So when we're looking at different cultures of the Green Sahara, people talk about Saharans and Proto-Saharans, which are primarily dealing with this Kifian and Tenerian populations. And these populations would be ancestors to ancient Kimi and Kush, as well as in many senses of the word ancestors to modern West African populations. And we're going to get into the relationship because a lot of people are really confused about the Saharan commonalities between different African populations. So we're gonna delve into that. So now you have shout out to Reggie Mabry. Reggie, when Reggie's in the build, it's always an exciting convo. And then we have Zuchedu. Initially, I think so too. Ancient Egyptian Deneg, Vorlov, Deneg, and Dange is really just a word for short. Absolutely. Zuchedo is speaking about some research that Dr. Abubakar Musa Lam has done in relationship with the lexical items referring to short people within classical Africa as well as contemporary Africa. And one example of that is Dinga Sise, who is the father of the Soninke lineage. And we actually have his ancestors in ancient Kimi. Like we actually have identified them by name, which is due to the research of Musa Lam, the great Dr. Musa Lam. So yeah, Zuchedu is right on target. Right on target. So what we have is the Savannah Pastoral Neolithic. So pastoral industries originating from the Sudano-Chadian border about 12 to 11,000 years ago, spread across the continent. And these were donkeys, goats, and cattle. And then you have the lighter bend complex, which is also called the Khartoum Neolithic or the Khartoumian Neolithic. And that spread from the Nile Valley to the Lake Chad Basin and then to the Malian Sahara, right? So this is an example of a commercial lineage that originated in ancient Kush, spread into Central Africa, and then spread into Western Africa. Another example of this is the Gajigana culture, which spread from Sudan and into Nigeria, mainly northern Nigeria. So that's another example of culture from Kush directly into West Africa. So most modern Africans on the continent today are the descendants of these agropastoral populations. So Dang or the neg is a word for Twa in Kemet. Absolutely. Oh yeah. This is in fact, this is where the info is serious stuff and he does it easily. Oh, bro, Reggie's a jewel. I mean, a lot of people hate on Reggie because they don't really understand his points. And, I get the whole YouTube beef thing. But, his information is like impeccable. Like he has a lot of like just the fact that he could understand the Medunit there and he could basically read the ancient Metrem Kimi glyphs is a very, very important feature, especially when it comes to comparative analysis. And we're going to deal with the prototypes later on. So look, you have pastoral domesticates. For all of the people who say that there's no relationship between Western Africa and the classical civilizations of the Remen Kimi, we just went over how pastoralism on the African continent or the African pastoral industry is contextualized within the African mode of production begins from the Sudano-Chadian border, 12 to 11,000 years ago. When we look at the specific domesticate industries for pastoralism, let's take a look. If you look at Equus africanus, which is the donkey, or Equus africanus asinus, this is first found domesticated in pre-dynastic Kimi in the 4th millennium BCE. And then it is subsequently found in West Africa in Siore, Senegal, around the first year of the Common Era to 250. Then we have Equus fergus or Equus ferus caballus. And Equus ferus caballus, or the horse, is found in the second intermediate period from 1786 to 1552 BCE. Then it is subsequently found in Western Africa in the Kumbu, Mali, from 600 to 100 AD. Now let's move on to Sus scrofa domestica. And Sus scrofa domestica is another name for the African pig. The earliest find is in 5th and 4th millennia BCE pre-dynastic Kimi, and then it is found in West Africa in the early 2nd millennia AD. Then you have Camelus thomasi dromedarius, and this is another name for the dromedary. And this is first found in Kasr Ibrim in the early 1st millennia of Kimi. And then it is subsequently found in Siori, Senegal from 250 to 400 AD. And that's the 1st millennia BC that Camelus thomasi dromedarius is found, right? So look, this is examples of domesticate industries that are first found in classical Africa and then subsequently found in Western Africa. Let's continue on. Then you have Ovis amon aries, and this is the African sheep. And then you have Capra agagrus hircus, and that is the African goat. It's first found in pre-dynastic Kimi in the 6th millennia BCE, and then it is subsequently found in West Africa from 2200 to 850 BCE. Then you have Bos primigenius taurus, and Bos primigenius taurus is found in pre-dynastic Kimi in the 9th millennia BCE, and then subsequently found in West Africa during the same period, 2200 to 850 BCE. Again, these are domesticates of pastoralism that are first found in classical Africa and then subsequently found in Western Africa. Obviously, that is an evidence of a connection between the populations and between the civilizations. All of the people who are saying that it's impossible to connect West Africa to those classical civilizations on the Happy River Valley, they don't have anything to say because you can't deny this archaeogenetic analysis. Now, moving on. Now, there's some critical flaws in the Saharan hypothesis. And the Saharan hypothesis is basically saying that all of these civilizations in Western Africa are primarily descended from green Saharan populations like the Tsanarian and Kithian related populations, and that there's not any evidence of any affiliation between ancient Kimi and Kush and West Africa. To connect ancient Kimi and Kush and West Africa is a cardinal sin. It is an absolute cardinal sin, but there's some critical flaws in that analysis. And what we're doing is we're looking at the parameters of cultural unity. And the different parameters, if you examine the different parameters of cultural unity, you examine areas where the Saharan hypothesis simply falls apart. For one, the Sahara is very large and contains cultures associated with every single stage of human development. You have early Stone Age cultures, middle Stone Age cultures, late Stone Age cultures, agropastoral cultures, Siderolithic and iron-using cultures. So just that alone makes it very, very difficult to pinpoint the nodes of cultural unity. Then you have Saharan cultures of the last human period existed prior to the age of urbanism, right? So you do have, cultures within the Sahara, but when you're looking at the commonalities between the civilizations in Western Africa and ancient Kimi, a lot of the commonalities are urban. They're related to the period of urbanism. So the Sahara is a little bit before that. Then you have a 600 to 800 year gap between the end of the Tichik culture and the beginning of Ouagadougou. So again, if you look at the Soninke, they actually identify their predecessors in the Galoma and in the Kokolo populations, who they say were the authors of the Tichik culture, right? And continuing on, you're going to notice the lack of material continuity between the Tichik culture and the onset of Ouagadougou in corroboration with those Soninke testimonies. And there's a lack of archaeological prototypes in the Sahara for West African industries, and just a lack of comparative archaeological analysis. So Reggie says the Brooklyn Museum points to the Green Sahara. Absolutely. The Green Sahara is indeed an ancestor of West African populations, and it is indeed an ancestor of ancient Kimi and Kush. But the issue that Africana scholars have formulated is the fact that when you're looking at the relationship between the Green Saharan culture and modern African culture, the relationship is purely faunal. And when I say faunal, it's purely related to a lot of these ancient animals and ancient domesticates. If we move back, when we're looking at the origin of Sus scrofa, right, in the 4th millennia BCE, and we move on to Ovis Amon Aries and Capra Agagrus Hercus, this is during the Green Sahara period, 6 millennia BCE. So Bos Primigenius Taurus, found in ancient Kimi in the 9th millennia BCE, this is in the eastern portion of the Green Sahara before migrating into West Africa. So when we look at hunting cultures as well as pastoralism, those are the main cultures that we find prototypes within the Green Sahara that existed within their descendants in ancient Kimi and Kush, and then subsequently West Africa. But when it comes to the other elements of culture, when you're dealing with urbanism, when you're dealing with agricultural industries, when you're dealing with many of the archaeological and architectonic prototypes, the majority of the prototypes in Western Africa do not necessarily come from the Green Sahara as much as they come from the Happy River Valley. According to the analysis of scholars like Nasir Sar, Dr. Musa Lam, in corroboration with Hamadi Bakoum and, Dr. Roderick McIntosh and Susan McIntosh. And yeah, fauna is a major factor. Fauna definitely is a factor for the development. And to articulate, Musa Lam's point, Musa Lam conceptualizes the Sahara as a primary cradle or a basal cradle, and then the Nile as a secondary cradle or the ancestral cradle. So many people have tried to root the Ouagadougou founding in the Chebka period, and we're going to get into the Chebka period a little bit later. But the Chebka period is not necessarily associated to the conflicts depicted within the Ouagadougou founding narratives. And so there's a lack of evidence for centralization and kingship in the ancient Sahara. And then there's a lack of evidence for a local development of iron industries in Takur. And some of the narratives of Yoro Diao explain the migrations from the Hapi into West Africa in, contemporaneous with the Siderolithic or iron using period. And you also have a lack of collective memory of Saharan origin among contemporary West Africans. And there's orature that confirms a Happy River Valley origin. If the majority of these cultures were primarily rooted in the Sahara, in the absence of influence from the Happy River Valley, you would have orature that confirms a predominant origin within the Saharan cultures. But most of the oral literature corroborates with the prototypes in the sense that it's more so leading to the Nile Valley, the Happy River Valley, as opposed to the Green Sahara. So Musa Lam he engaged within the architectonic analysis, and he reveals a spatio-temporal evolution of the material cultures of Africa rooted in prototypes in the Happy River Valley, right? And these reach a delicacy that excludes the possibility of parallelism. So a lot of people talk about convergent evolution and the similarities between the Rem Kimi civilizations of Kimi and Kush and Western Africa are due to convergent evolution from the Green Sahara. The Green Sahara is an ancestor of West Africa, and the Green Sahara is an ancestor of Kimi and Kush. The Green Sahara would be the parent of Kimi and Kush, and I would say the grandparent of West Africa, right? So without the Green Sahara, without the faunal cultures in hunting and pastoralism, you wouldn't necessarily have the foundation that we see within the classical civilizations of the Happy and West Africa. But when it comes to the majority of the prototypes of these cultures in West Africa, you don't find them in the Green Sahara, in the Kifian and the Tenarian cultures. You primarily find them in the Happy River Valley. So he first goes with the Murph farming tool, and this developed from a plant fiber braced timber prototype that you see here in ancient Kimi and Kush to a rivet fastened metallic tool in Senegambia. And the Kanjandu and the Alir garden hose in Senegambia were used for saturated soils. So then you have weaved wicker baskets of the Happy River Valley here, and they evolved into timber bowls defined by grip handles in Senegambia. And if you were familiar with a lot of the different baskets within the classical African civilizations, a lot of them evolved into ceramic systems. So it makes sense that there would be a spatio-temporal evolution of the wicker basket in the Happy River Valley to these grip timber bowls in Senegambia, according to Dr. Musa Lamb's architectonic analysis. So then you have harpoon instruments in ancient Kemet, and this is more so related to that faunal analysis. And actually, if you're familiar with the Ashango bone culture, the Ashango bone actually is what spread these microlithic and epipaleolithic industries into the upper regions of the Nile Valley and Western Africa, right? So these harpoon instruments of ancient Kimi developed into nylon coinoidal tools in Senegambia that firmly connect the harpoon to the shaft. So you have a spatio-temporal evolution here using nylon. Then you have lost wax casting systems developed in the Nile Valley from prototypes to inter-African innovations from Ghana to Cameroon, where crucible attachments were used to control the gas pressure and metallurgical flow during the casting process. And yes, all that's true. All of these tools are based upon glyphs in the Mduden Ter, right? And that's essentially why Dr. Musa Lamb chose them, because he could see the writing in the ancient glyphs. So then you have the hecaceptor of ancient Kimi, and this evolved into the Hogan scepter of Mali with an inflected hook, and you see that there, a midpoint disc handle, and a sharpened endpoint. And a variation of this design is the Hogan Kabyline scepter, Kabyline for horse, and you see that right there, right? So again, this is evolution, reaching a delicacy that excludes the possibility of convergent evolution and parallel evolution. So then you have the Ngulu sword of Congo, which evolved from the Kopes sword in ancient Kimi, developing a non-cutting back edge with semicircular concavity. You can see that semicircular concavity here. And the handle is wrapped in wires and contains 3 timber spheres, 2 large ones and 1 small one right there. Then you have the Wash scepter, and the Wash scepter prototype developed into a uniquely fabricated, freshly trimmed beam placed in fire to augment its elasticity and treated with oil to augment its material resistance and aesthetic qualities. And again, a lot of these spatio-temporal patterns that Musa Lamb observed were corroborated by Dr. Karen Excel in her article, Egypt in its African Context, submitted to Manchester University. So these aren't just some wild-eyed theory from like a crazy Hotep or whatever. These are actually legitimate scholarships or legitimate scholastic research that has been corroborated even by European scholars in some of the greatest universities on the planet. So again, you have the Happy River Valley headrest, which evolved into anthropomorphic models throughout Africa while retaining the same composition, base, and upright hanger. And you see that prototype in the classical Happy River Valley, and then you see this West African evolution of that has a more anthropomorphic model. Yeah, the wust derived from the antelope. Look at the hoof. That would make sense. That would make sense. And that would go back to the green Saharan parentage. So when you're looking at the regional architectural evolution, you have the Darticha culture, which starts around 1000 to 9 to 800 BCE, and you mainly have dry stone masonry of this Chepka period, right? And then around 600 to 300 BCE, you have the abandonment of this region during the Akinjer phase, right? And that is basically when the Akinjer phase is when some of these late Stone Age foragers were being attacked by agropastoral populations from the north and the east. And there's actually evidence of conflict, the same type of conflict described within the founding narratives of the Ouagadougou culture. So in the Bandiagara transition, right, in Western Africa, you see in the 5th century BCE, the Toloi culture, which utilized rammed earth building systems, so basically clay beams. And then you have a development of that by the Telem people who came after them, and they used adobe bricks with clay strands around the 11th century of the Common Era. And then in the 16th century, you have the Dogon, and they used mortarized and plasterized stone building systems. Now, those of you who saw my presentation on House of Consciousness, I dealt with some of the many features of African building systems, right? You have vaulted roofs with framed openings with moldings. You have external stairs, the impluvium or the courtyard. You have adobe bricks, which adobe actually comes from a Metrim Kimi word, right? In what's called Coptic. And, there's just a variety of features that you predominantly see within the classical architectural systems of the African continent. And in modern Africa, contemporary Africa, you have the evolution of these architectural systems. So when we're looking at Western Africa, we can trace different populations based upon the building traditions and the operation sequences from those traditions that we can observe within time. And from this perspective, if you look at the Dogon or the Ka'ador, using mortarized and plasterized stone building systems, which have an origin in the eastern region of the Saharo-Sahelian zone, it stands to reason that many of their testimonies about originating within those classical civilizations of Kimi and Kush definitely hold water. So we're going to get into the autosomal analysis, right? And Sahelian populations are unified. And before we proceed, let me just get my Cash App up for those of you who would like to support me, because it does take a long time for me to put this together. And I'm giving you tools. I'm giving you tools to use when you have conversations about West African history. And for those of you who are just coming in, we went over the fact that different periods of time within Western Africa have different cultures, different material cultures. And, they're not necessarily all related. The early Stone Age cultures are not necessarily connected to the Middle Stone Age cultures. And those Middle Stone Age cultures are not necessarily connected to the Late Stone Age cultures. So we have to be specific with what we're dealing with when we're talking about West Africa. You have to actually name some of these archaic human populations as well as modern Homo sapiens sapiens, because we're not necessarily the same species, even though we are related. So you have to mention all of those things if you want to talk about West African history. And right now we're going to get into some autosomal analysis that relates populations from Western Africa to Eastern Africa. Give me a 1 if you can hear me loud and clear. Alrighty, so when we're looking at the Sahelian populations, a lot of people like to talk about how there's just some massive difference between Western Africans and Eastern Africans. But Western Africans are actually unified by these Sahelian autosomal commonalities that go from Senegal to as far as Somalia. If you look at the SPAT2 gene on chromosome 12 related to spermatogenesis, the KRT39 and 40 on chromosome 17 related to keratin and hair follicle differentiation, and the PIG gene on chromosome 4 involved in the biosynthesis pathway allowing for the attachment of the cell surface proteins to the cell membrane. All of these Sahelian populations, again, from Senegal to Somalia, have these autosomal markers, which means they would come from a common stock. And that common stock, would most likely be a green Saharan stock, even though predominantly when we're looking at the material cultures, again, the majority of them would be derived from prototypes from the Happy River Valley. So again, this is when people talk about, is there evidence of a migration from ancient Kimi, what Europeans call ancient Egypt, into West Africa? Is there any evidence? There absolutely is evidence. If we examine the schistosomiasis studies, and this is a human pathogen, right? If we examine the archaeogenetics, the paleopathological analysis of these schistosomes, of these human pathogens, we can track a migration from the Great Lakes region to the Nile Delta around about 5,000 or so years ago, and then a subsequent migration to West, Central, and Southern Africa. So this would be some genetic evidence, some paleopathological evidence to validate the Happy River Delta as a cradle of African unity. Because this is showing, this is serious analysis. And I mentioned this when I was on House of Consciousness. This actually shows that there is definitely evidence of a mass migration of populations from the Happy River Delta in ancient Kenyan Kush into Western Africa. Our scholars at the UNESCO Symposium in 74 and the subsequent ones in 85, and then some of them in the 90s, discussed the Persian invasion and the Persian capture of Kemi around the 7th century BCE as a pivotal geopolitical moment within African history that forced the dynamism, the population dynamism, into the rest of the African continent. Now we have schistosomes to prove that this happened from a perspective of human pathology. If you look at these architectural or these agricultural cradles, and we're dealing with the domestication of plants or paleobotany, you have the super-Saharan cradle in what may be called the Mediterranean by Western scholars, the Oya Hapi Abyssinian cradle dealing with the Niger River Valley, Nile River, and Ethiopia, the Congo cradle, which in Central Africa, and then you have the Urewe Angolan cradle that descends from the lower part of the Great Lakes region into Angola. And there was no rigid dividing line between these agricultural cradles. All of them traded commodities. So all of these cradles traded domesticates between their cultures and civilizations. So when people are acting as if these African populations were isolated, this is absolutely not true. And in some cases, a lot of these rarer domesticated plants could even serve as currency. So this would even establish evidence of commercial relations between different regions of the African continent. So getting into the paleobotanical analysis, according to Dr. Roger Blench, this proves indisputable links between ancient Kenyan Kush and Western Africa. For those who say that that's impossible, that didn't happen, that's pseudo. According to the paleobotanical analysis, in corroboration to the paleopathological analysis in those human pathogens and schistosomes, this is showing what we discussed in the previous slide. Different cradles of agriculture trading items. You have Citrullus lanitus, or watermelon from West Africa in King Tut's tomb. Cajunus Cajun, or pigeon pea. It's likely originated in West Africa and spread to the Happy River Valley. Then you have Vinga inguiculata, cowpea, and this is West African in origin, and or two origin centers in the west and the east of the African continent. And then you have Ricinus communis, or castor bean, and this originated in East Africa around Somalia and Ethiopia, spread into West Africa. Abelmoschus esculentus, or okra, and it originated in Abyssinia and is now found throughout the African continent. Then you have Abris precatorius, or jumbo beads, and Moringa oleifera, which were traded from East to West Africa. Moving on, you have Tamarindus indica, or bent oil tree, found wild in West and Central Africa and eventually spread into East Africa. Then you have sesame, which originated in West Africa and was spread to ancient Kemi. Then you have Carthamus tinctorius, or safflower, possible origin in Ethiopia or Central Africa before spreading to Kemi. Then you have Oryza glaberrima, or rice, originated in West Africa, West and Central Africa. And then you have Oryza barthi, the wild species, which is found within the Nile Valley. Moving on, Vitellaria paradoxa, or shea tree, natural to the Sudano-Sahelian belt as well as Central Africa. Dioscorea rotundata, or yam, originates in West Africa and spread to Central Africa. Its cousin Dioscorea abyssinica is found in Eastern Africa. Then you have Digitaria exilis, or fundi, in West Africa, which originates from Digitaria longifolia in East Africa. And then the last one you have here, domesticated cotton, also known as Gossypium herbaceum, Linnaeus, and which is domesticated in the Middle Nile region around 5000 BCE and then spread to West Africa before 1000 BCE for the manufacture of cotton textiles. So again, when we engage within the paleobotanical analysis, we find indisputable links between classical Africa and contemporary Western Africa. Indisputable. So for those who say that there's no evidence of that, for those who say that it's impossible, it's obvious that you haven't been reading the literature and you're not engaged within this archaeological analysis, because these scholars say it's obvious, it's clear, it's right in front of your face. What are we going to do about it? What are the political implications of this? We have to figure that out. So now you have African testimonies of African traditions detailing their origin within the classical Happy River Valley. These are West and Central Africans. And what we're going to do here is we're going to see if there's any phylogenetic evidence to support some of the claims by our African ancestors. So you have the Sanga'am tradition in Western Cameroon by Ibrahim Bumbu Njoya, and he mainly speaks about a Seji, which he calls a Remenkimi, which essentially is a Manjara man from the Wandala lineage, right? And according to Ibrahim Njoya's inferences, he detects a classical African origin of a Seji and his wife Nabiju, who would essentially be the patriarchs of the Tikar, Bamileke, and Bamenda people of Western Cameroon. If we look closely, we see in the Old Kingdom of Classical Africa, AM13 AV2818 haplogroup descends from the AFGC 38326 clade, which has the AY161028 subclade found in modern Cameroon and Chad. So that AM13 marker in the Happy River Valley has a descendant clade that has been found in modern Cameroon and Chad. And then another subclade of this is found in Benin called AY161029. Then in the First Dynasty, you have EM35 EFT 321625, which has the EY161140 subclade found in modern Cameroon. So there's a First Dynasty subclade of EM35 found in modern Cameroon. Moving on, you have the 11th Dynasty LOA1B1A3 haplogroup, and it has the LOA1B1A3A subclade found in 10th century Chad and Cameroon. And when we examine EU174 and EU209, as well as EU290 found among the Bamileke, this descends from EM4706 and EM4254 found in pre-dynastic Kimi. So you have modern haplogroups of EM2 among modern Bamilekes of Cameroon that have ancestors found in pre-dynastic Kimi. Moving on, you have the Korutumu Ba tradition of the Mande, which details the ancestors of Lawalo Keita, the Keita dynasty being easterly in origin, right? So mainly, if you're familiar with Yamasoko and Sise at the Bamako Colloquium, where they detail the origin of the Mande people in the Keita dynasties, they figured out that the jurisprudence or the legal system of the Mande and the concept of the Sanankuya is primarily derived from a prototype within the Happy River Valley. These are all of the greatest scholars of Mali and of the Mande tradition. And they mainly detail Korutumu Ba, which to them in their tradition is the Great Water. Now, if we analyze the history of the Keita dynasty and its establishment in Western Africa, we understand that only one waterway fits this model, and that would be the Happy River Valley. So if we look at EY16 and 1140, or if we look at this EY161140 subclade, and that is a subclade of, let me see if I found that. That would be a subclade of this First Dynasty EM35 EFT321625. I know it's really complicated. That is how these genetic markers are read. So this EM35 EFT321625 subclade EY161140, which is found in modern Cameroon, also happens to be found among the Mandinka or the Mande people of Gambia, right? And the Old Kingdom EM2 subclade ECTS618 is found among the modern Mandinka of Senegal. So again, you have different haplogroups that originate in the Nile Valley found within the modern populations, these modern Mandinka of Gambia and Senegal. And this would validate a Kushite origin of the Keita genealogies of Western Africa. And you have the Jeddo Dewal that deals with Heli and Yo-Yo, which in classical Fulani consciousness would be Kimi Kush, according to the research of Dr. Musa Lam. If we examine the 20th dynasty EM2E Y23029 haplogroup, it has the EBY102326 and EFT397246 subclades that are found among the modern Gambian Fulani. So you have 20th dynasty haplogroups that have subclades that are found among the Fulani of Gambia. This is example of paternal lineage from the Happy River Valley into Western Africa. So these are just some more documentations of these classical origins. You have the Urere tradition of the Soninke of Ghana, the Geseri Barusu tradition of the Songhai of the ancestry of Dia Alayaman, the Euro Diao tradition of Senegambia, dealing with the ancestors of Dia Janjaye, the Jedo Dewal tradition of the Fulani, dealing with the ancestors of Ubatu Mali, the founder of the Fulani, Korotumuba tradition of the Mande, detailing the ancestors of the Kedas. And then you have the Ejiomate and Okaronko tradition of the Igbo, and the Awujali tradition of the Yoruba, documenting the same origin. These are orature, right? Documenting these origins. And right here on the right, I have a tree. I have a tree dealing with the ancestors of these different populations, Ule, Male, being derived from the Zagawa. And then you can see the subsequent lineages and contemporary West African civilizations here descending from these same origins. And now we're going to move on to some autosomal analysis. So before I gave you some sex chromosomes, these are sex chromosomes that detail in classical Kimi Kush, for those who say it's impossible to relate classical Kimi Kush to West Africa, then how in the world do we have subclades from haplogroups in those civilizations in modern West Africa? The fact that you have sex chromosome subclades from ancient Kimi Kush means that some of those populations migrated to West Africa and slept with the locals to produce some contemporary populations. So moving on from sex chromosomes, now let's deal with the autosomal analysis. There's autosomal analysis that relate West African populations to Eastern African populations. And I got to give a shout out to my elders, Dr. Nasir Sar, Dr. Gilbert Ngom, Dr. Musa Lam, Dr. Hamadi Bakoum, everybody at the University of Sheikh Anta Diop. You know, like, I got to give a shout out to all my elders, because this is not my information. I am just relaying to you a lot of their research, a lot of it being in the French language as well as their indigenous languages. So I got to give a shout out to my elders, because all of this data, all of this phylogenetic analysis, architectonic analysis comes from their journals and their papers. So we're going to deal with the autosomal analysis. And I got this autosomal analysis, some of these founding papers, from the Journal of Egyptology and African Civilizations, which many people know as Ankh Online Journal. So the Ewe and the Shanti people cluster with the Oromo people of Ethiopia. This is the autosomal analysis of the Ewe in Togo and the Ashanti of Ghana. The Bamileke and the Wando cluster with populations of Sudan, more so than modern so-called Bantu. The Fulani of Western Africa cluster with the Omodic Ari people of Ethiopia, the Barone people of the Middle Belt region of Nigeria, as well as the Hausa and the Chadic and other Chadic people, such as the Manjara of Cameroon, cluster with Nilo-Saharan people in Eastern Africa. This is autosomal analysis. So you have West Africans autosomally, which is the majority of the genome, who cluster with these East African populations. For those who say that there's no evidence of a relationship between classical Rem and Kimi and Kush and contemporary West Africa, why are these West Africans autosomally clustering to East African populations along the Happy River Valley? You have to explain that. Moving on. Mandinka in HV1 cluster analysis connect with the Rem and Kimi. So if you look at the HV1 studies of the classical Rem and Kimi populations, they're primarily closely associated with the Mandinka and other West African populations. And this is going to corroborate with the evidence, the sex chromosomal evidence that we've established here, dealing with the EM2 subclades of the Rem and Kimi that are found among contemporary Mandinka. This is genetic evidence showing ancestry between classical Africa and contemporary West African populations. So if you look at the dental morphology by Dr. Joel Irish of the Igbos and Yorubas, they cluster with Eastern Africans more than they cluster with West Africans. The dental morphology, the shape of the teeth of the Igbos and the Yorubas more so connects them with East Africa than it does to West Africa. So then you have the Sahara people of Chad, and they cluster closely with the Kunama people of Eritrea. So if there's no relationship between these populations, if they've been existing in isolation, separate from the rest of the continent, why does the autosomal analysis, which is the majority of their genome, connect these West African populations to Eastern African populations? You would have to explain that, but clearly there is a connection, and clearly we could establish phylogenetic evidence to justify the oral testimonies and orature of our ancestors, of our culture and our civilization. So when we're looking at this stuff, a lot of people in this space say, oh, the oral history of Africa is damaged. The oral history has been, it's been changed by the Arabs. One, that's not true. They're lazy in their analysis, and they don't want to analyze the typology of the orature and the background and the content and the time scale, which is what real anthropologists do. And two, when we look at the operation sequences in archaeology and we examine the relationships and the prototypes going from Eastern Africa into Western Africa, and then we have phylogenetic and even linguistic evidence to validate these origin stories, it's clear that the orature of West Africa maintains its integrity to the common day, to the contemporary era. So we can't try to lie on our ancestors and act as if they didn't do the thing. So when we're dealing with cycles of state typology, this is very important because it's dealing with the way that our ancestors, organize their states. And when you're dealing with the origin of states, be they hierarchical or hierarchical, many of the West African states and the way that they run the African mode of production has prototypes within the classical Happy River Valley. So this analysis comes from Dika Aqua, and I'm almost done here. And this basically is going to show you how states evolve within the African context. You have a pre-state, which would more so be connected to what we may call ethnic groups. An example of this is the Imhotep lineage-based ethnarchy, and it's the ruler of a city quarter. Then you have the territorial state, which is an example of this would be Mauritania. This would be a kingdom, nation, or federation. The superstate, which would be the Maghreb, if you're familiar with the Maghreb or North Africa, or predominantly where the Amazigh populations live, right? This is an interregional state or international empire. Then you have a pan-state, which would be an example of this would be the Islamic world. This is more of a universal empire, divine empire. What Garvey was envisioning in the Pan-African sense would be an example of this, or any type of spiritual or cultural, socio-cultural or political economic framework that goes beyond what we know as national boundaries. That would be the example of a pan-state, and that would be the highest level of evolution if we were to think of what would our African states look like if the Ma'afa had not occurred. And then moving on, this is going to be the final slide. And for those of you who are familiar with the presentation on the House of Consciousness, you're familiar with some of this data. When we look at the population called the Wangara, and these were mainly the dominant commercial class of West and Central Africa. They facilitated the development of states and the intensification of the cultures of West and Central Africa that we now know as these civilizations. So when you're understanding the connection between classical Africa, ancient Kimi and Kush, with respect to the architectonic phylogenetic evidence that we discussed previously, the way to envision it is to center Kush within the conversation, because Kush, or Meroe specifically, from the 25th dynasty onward, was the centerpiece of that mode of production and of that society, despite the many invasions of Western Asians, what we may call Amu. So from Meroe, you have the development of Kanem, or the Wangara inter-empire, in the area that we may now call Chad, into Western Africa. So that 7th century to 11th century trajectory describes the development of these contemporary West African civilizations. So you have Tajara, which Tajara would be the Lake Chad Basin area, Zagara, which would be Nigeria area, and then Galam, which would extend into the Oya and Senegal River Valley. And then from Galam, you have Jollof, Mali, Songhai, and then Galasima would be Central Africa and the Congo Basin, and then Galanjam would be extending into the Kuba, Luba, and Lunda empires. So when you're looking at the trajectory of these civilizations, examining the ancestor of Iranmiyan, who was the founder of the Yoruba people, Eri, who was the founder of the Igbo people, Lawalo Keita of the Mande and Keita dynasties, Ubatu Mali of the Fulani, all of these individuals, all of these ancestors that we could identify within our oral testimonies definitely descend from this same process. So we could go on to like the specific toponyms the specific linguistic analysis, but that would be another 3-hour show. But this is just a common logic and a common understanding. You cannot get to West Africa from Kimi Kush without traveling through Meroe. And you can't travel through Meroe to West Africa without passing through the Wangara and the Wangara Inter-Empire, primarily through what we may know as the Beriberi, or what may be called the Zagawa people. And then the toponyms from Manjara to Igala, and all of the different toponyms that we can observe across the African continent, the Ambangala, they're all related linguistically to these original populations on the Happy River Valley. So that would conclude my presentation, and I'm going to share the link for anybody who would like to come up and chop it up for a bit. Ooh, let me see. That is not what I wanted to do. Let me see what I can do. For anybody who wants to come on in, don't be shy. The link is in the chat. Also, if you have any questions about the presentation that you want to go over, maybe I'll leave it up and, could go back through the slides. What's good, Reggie?
What's good? I'm gonna turn off. I have to turn off my
your cam.
So yeah, not my cam, my connection to the stream, so it doesn't. Well, this has been very, very exciting. So you had a presentation before this that you had to stop.
Yeah. For some reason, people couldn't hear me. Nobody could hear me, and I was talking. And, I saw some comments saying that we can't hear you. You're just moving through slides. So I just stopped it and I reconfigured.
Yeah. Did you put yourself inside the, did you add yourself to the stream? Because I've done that.
That was probably what I did. I was probably talking and I didn't necessarily add that could have been part of the issue.
Yeah, that probably happened. Okay. So a couple of quick things. One is, we just have to set up a time. Can you rebroadcast this on my channel?
Yeah, easily.
On this channel, I'm sure that you'll get a lot more participation and some haters, but certainly some more interest and definitely some more cash apps.
Yeah,
so I would be happy to have you. What I would do is I would just copy this whole presentation back, right, and stream it, if you give me permission.
Yeah, easily.
And we just set up a time, and so that you can come in and you can talk. So so much information, so much information. I was watching it, and I didn't get together my my slides to add to it, but couple of things that needs to be added. The whole Chad Basin, you talked about it, right?
Yeah.
But there are groups and in that Chad Basin, and it's very fluid because they have water at a particular time period, and so they're traveling these tributaries on boats.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of material and communication from East Africa, Central Africa, and going into West Africa. My good study partner, Jedin Ankh, he is Dr. Ricketti's student. His metanetia is bananas, right?
Yeah.
He's doing a whole series on the agriculture and pretty much the agriculture and the early animals as they connect to the Nile Valley, particularly and like I said, fauna has a lot to do with the particulars of particular cultures. So the fauna in West Africa at some point is more forestry, and the during the Nile is more savanna as the Green Sahara kind of dries up. And so animals such as the ostrich is an incredible animal, but it leaves, it probably starts in South Africa, finds itself in the Green Sahara, and then leaves and goes back to the southeast, right? Does not necessarily enter into the West Africa, but there's probably a form of the ostrich inside West Africa. Um, the other part of what's happening in North Africa, and certainly that we need to kind of talk about. You certainly identified those groups. Some people want to call them Amazighi, some people call them Berber, but those particular groups, the Afri people, the Numidian people, those groups, we need to kind of like add into this area. I certainly said the aloe plant is one of those plants that seem to originate in southern Africa by Jedem Ankh, finds itself in the Green Sahara. I don't know how much of it is found inside West Africa, but it was an important medicinal plant for that for skin abrasions and things like that. But it certainly finds itself in the Nile Valley, and then certainly in Nubia. You see it, I think, as the rosette, as a rosette. So those are things of humans importing different types of plants. And then of course you're an expert on the structures of houses and the types of houses, and then there's the burial types. There's the tumuli that goes into here that is common, and also the kind of like megalith obelisk type structures. So there's just so much information, and guess what? The information is so new, right? And I wanted to talk about the structure that I think it's called the Rakete structure.
Yeah.
What is that? I mean, I know it, but tell the audience.
It's basically like this large geological formation that looks like an eye. People wonder whether it's a natural formation or whether someone did it. Maybe some people did it in the past. Cheddar, do you know anything about that?
I think that's the structure. Was it? Is it in Morocco or Tunisia or something like that?
Yeah.
No. Go ahead. I'd like to know more about that.
No. So the important thing is what we have. It seems like at some period of time, there's a lot of stone tools in that region, right? And there's also a lot of salt, right? And so these early populations, it seemed that there was possibly an earthquake that led to some type of tsunami that flooded that area. And also in those areas, you also have whale bones. And these are not ancient whale bones. These are whale bones from, I don't know, maybe about 10,000 BC or something like that. All in those areas, right? So how do whale bones find themselves in that particular area? At some point, it was submerged, but maybe it been temporarily submerged, right? Because you have so many whale bones um, uh, uh, in that particular area. But I will think of some more things. Um, oh, and then the whole what do you call it? The whole culture that I was talking about along the rivers, the harpoon culture, the cultures of water rafts where they're transporting cattle really early on, and this kind of Aquarian type civilization along those tributaries. And I mean, you certainly talked about it. That's why I'm talking about it. I didn't. I wanted to add, and I also wanted to add some of the early voyages of the ancient Egyptians into out of the Nile Valley into, for example, into Chad. So we know during the dynastic period, Mentuhotep, he finds himself in Chad, not him himself, but an expedition. And so there's oils. So it seems that they were trading some type of oil um, that was actually valuable to the Egyptians, but it came from that particular area. Do you know about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading some scholarship. I think Thomas Schneider was the main one who was dealing with like the Tabu people and the Teta people, and how you have some lexical items for their commodities that were traded into Kimi and Kush, as well as vice versa. And there was even a scholar by the name of Boubacar Diop, and Boubacar Diop did his doctoral thesis about the origin of the Serer people in Senegambia. And from his analysis, he actually came up with some references, classical references by the Greeks, including Ptolemy, that the Remen-Kimi could have traveled as far as Niger. And when he looks at some of the toponyms for the Serer, he finds a lot of them in Niger before, being in the Haber River Valley. So there's evidence that it wasn't just Chad; it was actually deeper into Niger and Western Africa.
Now the Sarah people, you pronounce it Sarah, but some people pronounce it as Sarah.
Saraya, yeah.
Sarah people, and they seem to be sun worshippers,
Hmm.
and there is some uh, commonality between those groups, those surviving groups, and the Nile Valley.
Yeah.
People don't we don't talk about. So um, whether you decide to, I don't decide you to tell you to leave your current occupation, but maybe when you get older and you have enough money, then maybe pursue, maybe if you want pursue a PhD, but that's after you've built your household.
That's in the cards. I mean, that's definitely in the cards, and I've been talking about that frequently. It's just like to look for the pathway, the professor, the politics. Like I've talked to some, I was deep into one program, and it didn't really work out the way that I wanted it to. Like the politics didn't really align. So like now I'm more so just in conversation with professors, trying to submit some literature that I have, and get published, as you said, be able to write an abstract and get published, which a lot of brothers and sisters
Like you
need to
said,
learn.
though, I think the gaps are closing in. Whereas we used to be separated by languages like French and this, that, and the third, and certain attitudes towards Africans. How we have Africans in the field, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Oh, they're ignored, and that's the point. So white ice is colder even in our culture in America because we are English speakers. And the problem is what he's bringing out is materials that's already published by African scholars that our young people are not paying attention to. All they know is Diop and Obenga as French speaking, but but to know all of the African scholars that are actually doing this work, because it's preserving of their culture. They're on the ground. They're from these places. So we in America, Zoo, we have a problem. We the it's not as close. French and Spanish, but are particularly foreign from us. There's a lot of Spanish scholars. Uh, we know about some of the German scholars, but the Black French scholars, and there's Black scholars in Germany and Spain and Portugal.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. The language barrier.
Spain for sure. But even Senegal has a pretty deep program. Um, Man, just people seeing people like Camjiverse, and thinking of myself, as well. I think I think it's just good to see.
Well, we
Compare.
have been, the thing about it is Canvas is one of our actual links. We had one good conference where we had French
Oh, you freeze? I think
scholars
Oh, yeah.
I think you froze up a little bit.
by, okay, can you hear me now? No?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, with Dr. Salim Faraji, or I should say Dr. Issa first and then Salim Faraji. That conference was a very, very important conference, and I was hoping that they would show it because we had Soy Kita, and we had a number of African scholars that contribute to Ankh Online that was there. Mm.
The chief editor. The chief editor was
Yeah,
there.
I think I saw the second half of that. I was wondering if we were gonna ever get the
The
whole
release.
thing.
Mm. Mm. I don't know internal politics and things like that. I'll just share my screen,
Yeah.
present, share screen,
Um,
this article that
do I have to give you permission?
uh,
Like, what's
I'm
going?
well,
I
I'm
bet
not sure yet.
I have a
I'm going
shout out to my guy Isaiah. My guy Isaiah stepped in. He's a really, really good friend. He does a lot of great work on the continent. So he's one of the heavy hitters in terms of my researchers and everything. So shout out to Isaiah. Shout out to Proof Evidence. Yeah,
so
I appreciate it.
this article you have to I guess you have to add it now. Yeah.
Mhm.
If anybody haven't seen this, just to bring in the Nile Valley, general ancient Egyptian interconnections, the West beyond the West, the mysterious warnings of the Egyptian underworld in the Chad Paleo Lakes. And so this article talks about this trek of the Abu Balas Trail. Sadiq actually um, uh, kind of popularized this. I don't know if you know Sadiq, that's on Smash's channel, that comes on Smash. But this trek that the ancient Egyptians took to Abu Balas Trail and landed in Gith Kabir, right? And and then you have this inscription from Mentuhotep II and Jebel Uwanet, right? And then this article goes on pretty much to talk about what they so what they're basically saying is the Amduit, the netherworld of ancient Egypt, was based on this trek to Chad, and they connected it. They looked at the Book of Gates and stuff like that, and it's protecting it. And then it's and then in hour two of the Amduet, right, is a region dominated by a gigantic body of water that fills the entire hour. a sweet water ocean that is the source of abundant vegetation on its shores. The text mentions the green plants that are in the wilderness, trees and fertile fields, and speaks of the unworldly God of the second hour as the farmers of the wilderness. The gigantic lake with its surrounding lands is given the precise dimensions of this Itaru. It is interesting to note that in the introduction of the second hour, the term uh, in NT Ray, the waterway of rays, believed to be the name of the first hour explicitly in awareness. And so, what the author is particularly talking about is that the ancient Egyptians preserved this trek,
Yep.
right? Preserved this trek to Chad,
That would be
right?
their Mecca, right? An example of their Mecca.
Yeah. Their primordial existence,
Yeah, I
right?
was saying that earlier. People thought it was really a joke, but you could actually argue that, Central Africa for a time was really heaven to the ancient Egyptians.
Right. And
Yep.
so they did not forget in their memory the ancient people, the Nile, the ones who are writing, they are repurposing. What they're doing is they're repurposing uh, their folklore into writing, and then and so that we have. This is a very, very good
The
article.
extent of their travel, because it shows like a lot of people are like, oh, that they couldn't travel in Central Africa because of the desert, but this totally disproves that.
Well, see, Kamji, that's what I wanted to point out too, because a lot of times when people talk about the oral histories, they don't bring up some of the geographical, geological, and some of the toponyms, like you brought up, the Korotimu
Yeah,
aspects of these traditions, and those add a lot of weight
they do.
to those claims.
They do, because a lot of people don't want to deal with the orature, because the orature prizes these classical African civilizations as part of African history, and a lot of people want to say that it was manipulated by Arabs or by Eurasians, but even some Europeans who are conservative, like Robert Law and Zatranuk, have stated that in many ways these traditions were changing dynamically in accordance to geopolitical positions, like the Qaeda dynasties being from Mecca, or Iran being from Arabia. Because of Islam, a lot of the superficial quality of these oral narratives was shifted to be advantageous to the ruling class who had converted, but like the
Absolutely.
core narratives didn't change.
You can really tell. You can really tell. I mean, it's like they'll have a whole build on Kemet or the trajectory, but Yemen might be 2 sentences.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just kind of like it's in past, and that's why it's important. Dr. Julde Laya was actually one of the main ones to speak to this in analyzing the typology of the oral narratives to see when and why they actually changed.
Mhm.
So I'm gonna get 42. I think 42's been waiting on, and then we'll let Shaka Raz in, and then we can let Reggie continue with the article.
Oh, goodness.
I don't want these people to wait.
Yeah.
42. What do you got?
Not 42. I don't know 40. I don't know if I know 42 piece 42.
Are you there? 42. If not, I think you
Maybe
unmuted yourself.
maybe he's trying to struggle with his the internet and technology.
Yeah.
Give him a shot. So bring on the next customer.
Shaka Ra, bro, Shaka Ra, you're up. Did you see the presentation, and if so, what did you think of it?
Greetings, my
All
brother.
right, my Chedo brother today, man.
Oh, I see. Greetings, bro. Greetings to
Got
the
you,
entire
got
panel. I can be heard, right?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, cool. First of all, thank you for the presentation as always. And yeah, I'm gonna have to watch it again. There was a lot in there, and I missed the first 30 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm gonna have to come back to that, but give thanks once again. Just a couple questions. First of all, am I correct in recalling that your assertion is that there is not a cultural continuity between the Tchik culture and Wagadu?
There is faunal continuity in the sense of some of the pastoral traditions
Right.
and some of the hunting traditions.
Okay.
But when we look at the founding narrative of the Wagadu, as well as some of their architecture,
Yeah.
and they clearly articulate, Dinga Sise coming from Aswan, the Aswan area.
Mhm.
And Musa Lam even has some research where he connects it. Like I think he uses the term, or he locates Susu Toure in connection to Satut Ray
Mhm.
during that same period of about the 7th century BCE.
Okay.
It's clear that even though there is some, like in terms of the architectural plan, like if you look at the architectural plan of Tikrit and you look at some Neolithic civilizations in Ethiopia, they have the same like proxemics, is a term we use in structural engineering, or understanding of space from a fractal perspective.
Right.
So there is certain elements that do go back within the ancient quote unquote Green Saharan tradition.
Right.
But the majority of the prototypes, especially the prototypes related to urbanization, the prototypes related to centralization, kingship, and a lot of the different material industries, and this is according to the research of Musa Lam that is corroborated by Karen Excel in Manchester University. I think that's over there in your area in the UK.
Yeah.
She corroborates his analysis of the spatio-temporal evolution of these cultures, including Wagadu, rooted in prototypes that we find on the Nile. Right?
Okay. Yeah, because it was principally the architecture where I was gonna go with it, because and what you're talking about in terms of the fractal nature of it, because that would definitely seem to be some kind of continuity, not just even with Wagadu, that there tends to be that formation in West Africa in general. Yeah.
And like a proto form of that would be probably seen in Kerma, if you examine Kerma.
Right. All right, cool. So just clarifying that there's definitely more research to be done there.
And I also want to get into, like I mentioned this when I had the chance to be on with Reggie. And if you look at the primary elements of what you could call classical African building system or classical African architectonics, what you do find is the usage of adobe bricks, which adobe comes from a Remen-Kimi word. I think Reggie may be a little bit better of discovering that root of adobe in Coptic. Then you have vaulted roofs with ventilation, vaulted roofs being a roof with a triangular pattern and ventilation being for airflow. Then you have these framed openings with hood moldings and external stairs. And this is a quality that you see in some of the terminal Akinjer structures. That's 600 to 300 BCE in Tikrit. But predominantly, these molding traditions will be rooted in Nubia, as well as bioenvironmental mimicry. That's another element. And that comes from, them trying to mimic nature and plants and animals. And then fractal proxemics that we discussed, projecting sills where the window, exudes from the structure, as well as the courtyard. And when you look at those elements, and there's a scholar by the name of Dr. Namdi Ella, I think at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He is a Nigerian scholar, an archaeologist, and an architectural scientist. And he analyzed these main elements, and he found roots, prototypes of those within house forms in the pre-dynastic era, a little bit prior to Narmer establishing Tawi as the civilization in that first dynasty. And then again, from that point, you see those same things in Western Africa. Not necessarily, like there's not necessarily a total continuity between Tikrit and modern West Africa, because during the Chebka period, about 1000 BCE, they were using dry stone masonry, so just dry rocks stacked upon each other. Whereas now in Western Africa, you see them using mortar, you see them using plaster, like things associated with modern construction. So there's some elements that are definitely Saharan in origin, but the predominance of these architectural traditions from, Nnamdi Ella's analysis and others would come from the Hapi.
Okay. Now, to clarify a point, yeah, because the more we study these things, I think there's a certain point that gets missed sometimes, which is that the extent to which the Nile Valley is a beneficiary of the rest of Africa before becoming its benefactor.
Oh, absolutely. I would say absolutely a huge beneficiary.
Right. Okay. Because I think that point often gets lost, and I think in order to understand this concept of the cultural unity of Black Africa, that needs to be emphasized quite significantly, in my humble opinion. I got one final question, and I'll yield the floor. If you did mention, I missed it. Iboku, and Knock, yeah. Where would that factor into your analysis in terms of cultural historical continuity in West Africa?
I would say that for the first statement that you made, I did mention that a little bit previously when I spoke about the Kithian and Tenarian, which is the predominant cultures of the Green Sahara, being primary ancestors of Kimi and Kush from like Gobero, Niger area into the Nile River Valley, and alongside them, like if you look at Agazer in Niger, there's the Agazarian iron tradition, and the iron tradition in those classical African civilizations on the Nile descend from that. So they would be ancestors, and then you have the Aboran culture around Lake Nakaru in Kenya, which is about 13,000 or so years ago. That would be an ancestor to Kimi and Kush as well, in terms of it spreading, these epipaleolithic industries up the Nile into the delta. And Rekit, Reggie knows that term in the Meduden Inter. It's the kind of the term for the fishermen. And what was the second part of your question again?
No, it was referring to the Iboku civilization.
Oh, Iboku, yeah, that's right.
And Nok civilization prior to.
Absolutely. So Iboku, Christopher Ehret, and I'm not the biggest fan of Christopher Ehret's linguistic analysis, but according to his research, those terracotta traditions of Nigeria, mainly northern Nigeria, where Nok is found, would be derived from like Nigero-Kordofani timber traditions around Sudan. Right, and if you look at the Kordofanian origin of Nigero-Kordofanian, if we were to use the Greenbergian matrix, as well as like the Gajigana culture and the Lighter Band complex, that kind of makes sense. Ibo Uku, there's a scholar, I'm blanking on his name. He has a Nigerian last name, but when he's learning about the origin of the Igbo people, he uses what's called the modified Northern Common Center model. And that's basically dealing with the idea that these green Saharan populations migrated down upon the desiccation of the Sahara about like 5,000 or so years ago. And then you have some.
It's not Ekpo Ayo you're referring to.
Ekpo Ayo. I don't know if I'm familiar with that.
Okay, cool. Well,
Ekpo Ayo. So like what I would say to when you look at the genetics, so the Igbo genetics or the Hausa genetics, and you see that the majority of these populations would be agropastoralists, or they're not necessarily related when we examine the autosomal analysis or the full genome. They're not related to these foragers, these like diminutive type populations that all African people essentially have a oral history about these different populations.
Right.
So their populations, if we're talking about pastoralism coming from the Sudano-Chadian border, or just essentially the material culture of Western Africa, which, conventional scholarship roots within the terminal Pleistocene, or the so-called Ibero-Mauritian or Iranian culture in Northern Africa, which some believe that the quote unquote, and I hate to use these terms, but the Niger Saharan or Congo Saharan family would be from the Iranian culture, from the Nile to the Maghreb.
Right.
The vast majority of these material culture industries, when we deal with the development of agropastoralism, are northeastern in origin. And according to like the research of McDonald and other archaeologists, McIntosh, around 4,000 to 1,500 years ago, and this is one of the earlier slides, you see kind of an assimilation of these ancient late Stone Age foragers who would be responsible for the Tichet and the Igbo Ukwu culture,
Right.
and some of these earlier cultures mixing in with agro-pastoralists
Right.
from the north and the east, and then the intermingling with the agro-pastoralists dominating is how
Right.
we get contemporary West Africans.
West Africa. Understood. Just to clarify,
Yeah.
for those who may not be aware, Professor Ekpo Ayo is an archaeologist from Nigeria. He deals principally with Can't you say so for enough? Wow. Yeah, he deals principally with Nok civilization, and he suggests that the Nok civilization could go back as far at least as like 3000 BC, based upon the advanced nature of their art at a particular point in history. So just a point for those who may not know who Professor Ekpo is.
That's a good point. Like I accidentally fell off. I think 42. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, if my mic is working. Oh,
Yeah,
now I
got
see
you.
my thing bumping, so I know it's working now. Yeah, actually I want to blame StreamYard, but thanks for the invite, because I did have some questions, some pretty simple stuff, because we could rap and argue all day, I bet. But it's and I didn't see the entire presentation, so I want to go back and watch it. But I did wonder, like, how would you say Yam factors into it, like that nation and that was spoken about in Egyptian history, and how large do you think Yam was? Like, how would you say it factors into the early peopling and exchanging of pretty much everything between the Nile Valley and populations that would later populate West Africa, West, and probably other
I think I'm gonna let
avenues.
Reggie answer that question.
Yeah, so Yam is one of the Nubian groups that is identified, and so it's to me it's more of a particular group of Nehesi, right? So the Nehesi seems to be a confederation of several types of groups, and if I get a few minutes, I can pull it up. So I don't. I'm, we have a early description of the Nile Valley of the what you call Egyptian civilization in the Old Kingdom with Winnie and Harkuf, and they talk about the Yam territories, and so these groups had confederations, and they're dangerous. These groups are very, very dangerous groups, right? And so you just couldn't just walk into their territories because they had set boundaries with each other. And the ancient Egyptians were able to use those groups later in wars. They made the Magi as part of the group. I can see if I can pull up the Nehesi groups, but Yam is more to me like a people. If that helps.
Just wanted to jump in and see what you think about this, because one reason I think their territory might be larger than it would just seem based on like what we see in Egyptology, because it's really like, I think around the time like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when they found the trade route heading west. But before that, it was like Yam was supposed to be closer to the Nile. But I'm wondering, since there is some history about them fighting with, like, I think it was the Tehenu, the people who are associated with like Libya and further North Africa, and then at the same time the trade route is going more south. That's why I'm wondering if their land might have been large enough to the point where you could go towards their land heading towards Chad, but you're still entering a location that's large enough to fight with Northern Africa, to have a war with people closer to Libya. You see what I mean? Like
Yeah,
that.
I got you. I mean,
That just makes me think it was a larger,
ancient
larger
Egyptian
nation than I would have initially imagined.
nation or confederation.
I don't know. Like I would think like a nation can become a confederation pretty quickly because they weren't alone. But I would think they might have been more alone towards the pre-dynastic, but because I don't really know of too many other groups that were talked about at that time besides, I think the Tehenu, or if I'm saying that name correctly, existed, and then Egypt was split. And then I think Kerma was around. But I'm curious if anyone knows more about the pre-dynastic. Like that's where I'm most curious about when it comes to anything involving ancient history.
Yeah, oh, I try to do these days. I actually try to do more pre-dynastic work than I do ancient Egyptian work. I'm just not. I think that's oversaturated. And it's a lot of there's more work to be done now with what Kamji Verse is doing with the various disciplines and the Nubian groups. But what happens is that until we actually have writing, then we have writings from the ancient Egyptians about them, right? Because they are writing, and we don't have, and then after that, then we would have to look at settlements and try to identify a particular settlement. But if we identify a different settlement without writing, we can't say that they are the people of Yam, right? But then you have to factor in all the other groups. You have to factor in all the other groups that are there, and then you have to try to figure out some type of methodology to kind of separate them, right? And
yeah, there is like a scholar Saul, like that Reggie wrote an article about the Great Lakes region being the origin of the Nile and basically where the ancestors said that they came from. And Boubacar Saul corroborated Reggie's research with his analysis of the Aburan culture, and alongside that with Yam, according to his analysis, Yam would have extended from South Sudan, or Darfur in Sudan, all the way down to northeastern Congo. So that, along with 42's research, Reggie's research, according to Saul, it could be corroborated.
Okay, so all right, so I'll just share my screen, give you an article that that okay, so 42. So the problem is, how do you identify this particular group without written words? How? Because I hear what you're saying. I just want to just because now you bring into pre-dynastic. That's how can I say? Until we actually have descriptions. Okay, so in this particular article, it's by.
Let me add it to the stream real quick. And before I continue, for Rose Shakara, that scholar that I was talking about is Loganus Chukwuemeka Chinagorum, right? So he was the one dealing with the origin of the Igbo. So with that, we're gonna read. We'll let Reggie go off.
Yeah, I'm gonna go off. Okay, so what I just tried to say is that writing written records, right, help us. So before the sixth dynasty, the fifth dynasty, we have Harkuf, which I mentioned, right? And then the earliest mention of what we call Nubia, or known as Lower Nubia, is Taseti, right? from the first dynasty. So the Egyptians pretty much called those groups of people Ta Seti, the land of the bow. So these people are hunters with the bow, right? So then we get to we get to a inscription of the various groups, where we are pulling from the inscriptions, and so we have Nahesi as a possible to see some regiments of Winnie's army, of which, among others, are the Urtjet Nubians, right? They're Nahesi, Nahesi. There's the Magi Nubians. There's the Yam Nubians. There's the Wawat Nubians, Nahesi, and the Cow Nubians. And Smash shows the actual inscription. Maybe it's in this particular article. So now to say that the Yam Nubians, we would have to say, well, what in fact, what data do we have of these particular Nahesi groups of people? So I'm going to search through this article right here to see if they actually have the inscription in the Medu Neter. No, they do not. So this is where the Ta-Nehesis are, right? In this particular region between Kerma and Sao. And to try to find out more data about them. I know Budge, I think it's Budge that actually has the group. But at this time period, right, they're calling them this, I think, the C groups. And so to find more information, particularly about them, I think that is a little bit difficult.
That's powerful. You don't realize how powerful what you just did, because you showed us the toponyms that are scholars like Ziot, where he connected Gao of the Songhai to Cao, and then he connected Dia Alayaman, Yam in Nubia. You just showed them the toponyms for their ancestors in classical Africa.
Right. So the thing about Ziot was such an incredible scholar because he paid attention to what was relevant. It's not like he was doing the original research. He was a spokesperson, and then he was making analysis that could be made by different comparative methods and stuff like that. And so going back to, here it goes, these particular groups, the Cacao, and we know the Cacao is basically a cattle group, right? We know this is a cattle group. And so I wanted to get to another part of what you actually said. So I'll stop sharing my screen. I want you to talk a little bit more about the Dong people, the Dang people you mentioned.
The Dong, the diminutive populations.
Yeah, you mentioned a group of people called the Dang.
Yeah, there's if you look at Dinga Sise, the founder of the Soninke dynasty. I actually have a book. Let me go get my book, because Musa Lam actually documents some of his ancestors from Aswan. But real quickly, Dinga, there's lexical items in West Africa to refer to short people as Dang or as Deneg, right? So that's another evidence, dealing with morphology and phonology of a connection.
Well, who else uses that? Because I isn't that also what they're called in Egypt, in Middle Egyptian?
That's what I wanted to show. I wanted to show the Dong people in ancient Egypt as one of those groups. But go ahead.
Because for some reason I got that a similar description or similar wording for dwarves too. I don't know where I got it from.
The Songhai, Wolof, some Mande people, it's throughout Western Africa.
But I think I was looking at like Egyptian dictionaries. That's why.
Well, that's where you would find, and that's what I was going to show you. I was going to show basically from two sources. But I wanted Comtiverse to talk a little bit about those groups, and I wanted to know. So can you give me some more information
about the Soninke? So I have some evidence here. So I'm right here in my hand. I have Le Chemin du Nil, and that's basically the pathways of the Nile by Musa Lam. and he deals with the ancestry of Dinga Sise traveling to Ouagadougou on those Sahelian waterways using some canoes. And according to the orator, the oral narratives, he actually has the ancestry of Dinga listed. He knows the ancestor of Dinga, which according to this orator is Yugu Dengusi, and he was the ancestor of Dinga Sise who left the Aswan area in the direction of Ouagadougou, and his son Shirion Tambadunka is the father of who we know as Dinga Sise. So for me, you know, the Soninkes have a long legacy. They got a long legacy in Western Africa, and they're very prominent in terms of their divine kingship. And I know some of our friends may be able to articulate that a little bit more about like just some of the correspondences relating to the transcendent one, the eternal verb, and what we may call sacrifice. That
Absolutely.
is another.
Their whole pantheon really is you know, like in that book, Lum compares them to the Egyptian ones. You know, even in
Yeah, he does.
the actual story of the trajectory from Kemet to West Africa, he's guided by the jackal, he's guided by the vulture. You know, the whole all the ideas are there. All the ideas are there.
Well, so you know, we have these. We go into the dojo, I call it. When I spar with my friends, my fellow peers, we go into the dojo. So it's never like a debate or anything like that. A gotcha. We're just adding information, but we do throw axes and swords and shoot at each other. We just nick each other, right? So human sacrifice is something that seemed to have been born in the Nile Valley around the Nubian populations, and the ancient Egyptians is a child of that culture, and they they continue to practice. But those people that went on around the waterways and stuff like that, and went to Chad and then to West Africa, that is something that they kept alive very seriously, and so did the Nubian people, so did the Shylock groups and the Dinka groups. So when the king died, the king was not going alone, right? Yeah. And so, but I did want to show. So I just share this. It's getting late for me, but I'll share this just for the correspondent, the talk.
Can I jump
Even
in?
that,
quick?
I find that to be a really point of strong correspondence, because as much as people might think that say people like the Wolof have been completely Islamicized, the indigenous expressions for heaven, the indigenous expressions for a person that has passed away are find their closest links in Kemet.
Could I ask a question on that, if I may? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kanjuas, I seem to recall you making a statement about the extent to which the oral traditions have been altered in the presentation. And I've done some research on this. I'm not an expert on it, but correct me if I'm wrong. Were you challenging the idea that the oral traditions have been altered?
No, I'm not challenging it. I challenge the idea of the extent which most people that I've seen talk about this issue claim that they were altered.
Okay, because I think the reason why I asked the question is because I think, especially in terms of what our brother Zuchedo has just said, there is like, for example, one of the most obvious ones here, the origin of the Yoruba people, for example. Mm-hmm. There's definitely alterations that are inspired by religious
absolutely
affiliations there. I mean, Diop in pre-colonial Black Africa speaks to this idea of Sharifism, which is a tendency among Africans who have been Islamized to alter their origin story to connect it with the Sahaba, what's it called, or Bilal, or Muhammad himself, right?
Yeah.
So I was just clarifying the point basically that you were making there.
If I could just say, not to cut you off, but just one thing that I know is that often when people talk about the syncretism that's found in these oral traditions, it's almost as if to them the Islamic hegemony has completely vanquished
right,
the indigenous system,
right,
whereas the act of synchronizing itself is part of saving it and keeping it alive, right?
right.
Yeah, and I talk about that a little bit in my video
Mm.
about the Kemetic roots of West Africa, how you didn't necessarily have a minister of truth, like the Oba of the Yoruba people or the Eri of the Igbo, the Ezinri. They couldn't just change every single thing willy-nilly because
No, of course not.
within the socio-political structure, you had safeguards against that.
No, it definitely still exists. Even among the Hausa, you can still find elements of their indigenous spirituality. In fact, some of them are not even Muslim, right? So you still find the elements there in the syncretization. So yeah, I fully accept that. I was just really clarifying your point.
Yeah, and I would just say that superficial changes don't necessarily totally dilute the core narrative.
Yeah, it's complicated because even in the Nile Valley, and I do want to show what I have to show, but even in the Nile Valley, you have the Nuba people, right? They speak Arabic, but they sing their songs that is not, they sing in Arabic, but it's not with Arabic themes at all, right? And so a lot of this happens where there is kind of like a I forgot the word, a combination of
Heterogeneous.
Yeah, right. Heterogeny, right? Heterogeny of you're using a new language, but you put cultures in it. And we also have to understand is that when we think of Islam in Africa, these are people who largely took the oath of the Shahada oath to be a Muslim, but they didn't know too much about the language, right? They had dress and style, but they didn't know too much about the language. You actually need the Quran. So you had some clerics that would come in and teach them, but they're basically Islam by oath, not by faith. But they are fusing in their traditional cultures
with the thing. No, I'd agree, and I think another reason why the question is relevant is because sometimes the migration stories from the Nile Valley are being used and altered in order to extend to Saudi Arabia, quote unquote Israel. Yeah, depending on where you think that was situated and so on and so forth, right?
I mean, that was there. We do have evidences of like commerce and trade and alliances going back and forth. So it's not to say that it didn't happen.
No, of course.
We know geopolitically why they made those changes.
Yeah.
But the cultural attitudes that you find within the text really underline kind of what Reggie was saying, because for instance, we all know Allah is not created, has no partners, but to refer to Allah as expression, you say Mam Yalla. Mam Yalla means ancestor God, right? And there's so many things within the text that are not specifically, would not be necessarily smiled upon by the most strictest Islamic.
There's big problems. So Morocco, for example, Morocco, how can I say, this whole conquest of this cleric, I forgot his name. I'm getting old, y'all. I'm 58 years old. But this Sufism and this connection with African faith was just something that this Ibn Yasin, he was a cleric, a Berber cleric, and he cleric, and he he started the revolution that created Morocco, and so he did jihad. He did jihad against the African tribes, who many of them were Islamic, but they weren't strict Islamics, and so thanks to him, we get Morocco. And then he had a general called Abu Bakr, not the original Abu Bakr, but and then Abu Bakr ended up attacking the Ghana, but not the Ghana that we know, but the Ghana of that period.
Ouagadougou.
Yeah. And
Yeah, in a couple of the oral traditions, they talk about how a blind Serer man shot him with a bow in the eye. He died.
yeah, good.
So you can pick up on the attitudes,
Good. So yeah, they had to. It was a lucky shot, so they say, right? Because they have to keep the Arab stuff alive. I did want to show this for anybody, and we can learn a lot from this. So I'm searching the word dwarf.
Yeah, it is. It's DNG.
Okay, so I'm going to get to that, but there is this word called. Is this the first one? Inmu, right? Now, Inmu, we can't tell from here that this is an Inmu, but it's a short-statured person. So let's just go and find another word. Okay, so now we have the Dang. He's a pygmy and a dwarf, right? Right? But then it gets interesting, and we can just see with the glyph that we know that means under, could mean small, right? That makes up to that, and they're describing what they call a dwarf, right? But then we see there's another version, and then we see this version here where now they are describing this person alongside of a taller figure who's kneeling, right, and seemingly praising him, right? And so this is a group of Africans that they knew of, and these people are in Nubia. But there's something else that's important. Here he is, right here. So here's Inmu. So this is how we know, and Inmu is basically mu is water. Mu is water. So it seems like this particular group of Inmus were water people along the waterways, right? So so the ancient Egyptians is interesting being helping us. Maybe there was two groups of the Inmu, right? And there's another word for dwarf, which I will find. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. Okay, so here's another term. So some of these people could be from different locations, but I do want to find out more, maybe on another show, about how my brother is talking about yam, and I wanted to show this, and then I'm going to go to sleep. Thank God. So yeah, so here in the same particular article, the author is talking about a pet plays a big part inside the mythical Noor. So here you have this rock python, right? And possibly a pet. And what I'm just trying to say is that their Amduit may be in this area. And this is a great map that I think supports Kamji versus work, talking about the different groups. So the Proto-Saharan is over here. The Proto-Sangay, right, is over here. There's Lake Chad, and there's Nubian movement over here.
Are you sharing a different screen?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Okay, so present. Yeah, share screen. I thought.
On top of that, like before you continue, like if you look at Musa Lam's research and what you presented with Deng, he actually finds a term in Wolof called Dungune, right, to mean dwarf. And there's another one in
right.
Cool. Let me see if I can find it. Like it's an article that he submitted.
There's Tune, and then you have Ndama, which reminds me of the one that
Yeah, Dama. Yeah, that's another one.
you
Dama.
know, and
Right.
Kus also Kus. But I think that but see all these words, Tune is one that's really tied to like a lot of like the stories, you know what I mean, about like
Mhm.
how the small people have all like the was and stuff. And I
Dunguro.
guess the reason why I bring that up is because maybe that has more more historical weight to it. But I don't know. I'm just saying.
Luciano, do you actually speak Wolof fluently?
Yes, for sure.
Nice. Did you speak Fulani as well?
No, I wish.
Okay,
I
so
know a
like,
few words.
so Lamb connects Dunguro to the Wolof word, which is Dungune. Is that how you say it? Dungune.
Tune.
Dungune. So like, dang, that Reggie just showed would be the
Yeah.
predecessor of those two terms.
Well, yeah. Well, what I showed was just a transliteration. We don't know how it sounds, and so that's the work of Diop and others that we're trying to actually combine and find the real sounds.
Yeah.
Because that's just the transliteration. The transliterations is not the actual spoken language.
Yeah, that's true. It's not a living language, and you'd have to use like Coptic or another living descendant. And according to Gilbert and Gomes' research, Sawa and Medumba and other Cameroonian languages would fit into that mold. According to Musa Lam's research, Wolof and Fulani would fit into that mold. So that's more of a linguistics of getting the basic lexical items and showing the sound correspondences to establish the pre-dialectical form of whatever the word was.
Right, but yes, or using the actual modern or more modern words as probably what it is.
Yeah,
right?
like Kimi versus Kemet. That's what I prefer to use.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Working back. So this particular map is some of the things that Camden Verse I think was talking about in some of the periods. So over here we have the Nilo-Saharan heartland, and they have it marked out as 8,000 BP, right? Before the present. The Proto-Saharan, 9,000 before the present over here, right? Then they only have the Proto-Sangha at 6,000, and then you have the people around the Lake Chad, around 12,000 BP. Then you have the Central Sudanic, 6,000 BP, and this group over here, the Proto-Kuliak, 3,000 BP. So this I think is a good map to illustrate some of the things that you were actually talking about, and looking at the different types of peoples, right? So here, here it's interesting that where we think of ancient Egypt, you actually have Nubian, and Smash has done some really great work on that. Nubian is a false term, by the way.
Yeah, it is.
It probably derives from Nubit, right? In Egypt, there's two versions of Nubit, and they're basically like, it's like the city of gold, right? Or the gold citizens or something like that. And that becomes Egypt proper later, right?
So did you know that? Sorry to cut you off, but you know that Finch has an article for Ankh Online where he identified Takenset with the Great Lakes region, or the placenta with the Great Lakes region.
Okay. I mean, you have to show me what Finch has a new book out, by the way. He has a new book out, but I don't know about Finch's meta nature, right?
He did it more from like an archaeological perspective. He didn't really get into like the lexical items that much, so to speak.
Yeah. So I just he's one of our elder scholars that is actually still doing work, many of our elder scholars are pretty much just repeating things that are not necessarily tested from the time period in which I met them, which is in the 80s. So I met them in the 80s, 84, 85, 86. I met Finch and Van Sertima, and it was wild. But Van Sertima's journal was really, really good. But they had some of the great young scholars at the time, Yosef Ben Levi and Dr. Riketi Amen, and a lot of great people at that time. But the stuff with Musa Lam and all this other stuff that's coming out by Diop students is really
it's on a different level.
Yeah. Camzy verse is on a different level. So I grew up learning, listening to Dr. Runoko Rashidi and others, and then even my elder Dr. Ben, and Dr. Ben was so right on so many things and wrong on a few things, but the way he wrote at this time period, talking about Moses and stuff like that, this wider conscious community uses word for word what Dr. Ben says against us. And then we have I don't know what you think about Camby verse. He doesn't like to get into infighting in Netta Studios, but we have this dude named Sekou Keller.
Sekou.
And Sekou is he regurgitates a lot of old information. He tried to do the two cradles theory.
Well, that's all right, and I gotta correct myself. So what on my previous statement about Takense, because I have the article on my phone right now. So it was actually Jean-Paul Belec who wrote an article, and he used one of Finch's references for Takense, as the Ishango bone culture in the Great Lakes region. So I could send it to you if you want, so you could take a look at it, see if it's valid.
Yeah, it would. Well, I can look at it. Who am I to say that it's valid? I'm just like you, but you much better. I can look at it, and I'm only good when there's some meta nature.
Yeah.
And I'm not as good as you on a lot of other things. And this whole area, actually, believe it or not, is kind of new. It took me some time to break away from the whole ancient Egyptian, and I only did that maybe about 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. I just decided just to completely break away from because I thought it was just being taken over by pseudos who are.
You know what I said about that, and maybe Shaka Ra can speak to this a little bit in the UK, but the American, like, quote unquote, Kemetic community is totally disconnected from Africa, like completely 100% disconnected from Africa. When I look at Africans, especially in the Francophone African world, like when they talk about,
I said that in the chat today and got mad pushback.
Yeah,
some of y'all are running to Kemet, but y'all scared of Africa. It can't work like that.
Oh yeah.
But here's the deal. Like, okay, so in America, if you see brothers and sisters rocking with chematology, you're gonna see them talk about chakras. You're gonna see them talk about karma. You're gonna see them talk about like Indo-European stuff. Whereas, like, if you go to Africa, particularly like the Kamit movement in Africa, in Francophone Africa, you'll see them connected to their living cultures, like their living traditional, belief systems and rituals of, La Croix in Cameroon, and maybe certain Marabout traditions in Senegambia, right? So it's not necessarily connected to that.
Even me, honestly, to be completely honest with you, like, it's starting to get a little too much.
What do you mean? What do you mean by, because you have family in Senegal? So like, what do you see?
Because even on the French side, you'll see that people's, and I understand it.
Yeah.
People's first go-to is the spiritual stuff.
Yeah.
They grab the candles, even if they get away from mixing it with all of this
new age
outside of Africa stuff, right?
Yeah. Indo-European stuff.
Yeah, And that's why, like, the other time I was bringing up the Geru Ma'ap thing,
Yeah.
because that's in Wolof culture today. Gor,
Yeah.
Gore Island even itself, is from another name, but they calqued it to a Wolof concept,
Mm.
which is a honor code, you
Yeah.
know, and
You said Geromod?
yep,
Geromod? What you
yep,
said? Okay.
yep.
So that's a word that some people might not be familiar with. Are you familiar with it, Cam?
Well, I mean, I see Ma'at in there. But
Yeah.
yeah, that particular term, like it harkens back to like Gorma and some other toponyms that I've seen, like in the Burkina Faso area, and tracing the migratory patterns.
Yeah.
To answer your question, bro, in relation to the disconnect, this is an interesting one for me because I'm coming out of an African spiritualist organization, so to speak, right? And there have been some battles, I should say battles, but some interactions with our brothers and sisters who have a propensity for Kemet, but don't necessarily relate it to the rest of Africa, even on a spiritual level. Yeah, and then there is a sensibility as though, like, spiritually speaking, Kemet it is somehow, they may not use this terminology, but it comes across like this sometimes. But it's like Kemet is superior to the rest of African spiritual.
Yeah.
Right? This I'm saying, if that makes sense.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So
for me,
say again.
I mean, for me, I would say that's a good point, but I may not agree with why they agree with that point.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Right. But
Yeah.
so there is that element to it as well, and I think for those, I think there are those who just simply see Kemet as another expression of African spirituality, if we're talking about it on a spiritual level. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so would just put would just
Well, I was just to tie it together. I think, like, the thing is too that it's still new, and people can't be disingenuous and act like, even if you're tying it to the stuff from your village, it's still new.
No, I'd agree. I'm not one of them people that feel like something needs to be ancient for it to be valid, right?
No.
You know what I'm saying? I'm not one of them. So I think that we should be honest about our current evolutions and own them. We are allowed to evolve what our ancestors left.
Absolutely.
And it became even more interesting for me because I teach what is referred to as Simatawi, Tefnetaru, or what's it called? African yoga, right?
Yeah,
that's a recent development.
Okay.
It is. That's a reconstruction, and
Yeah,
I know Reggie has a lot to say about this topic, but I would say that on the point of the Ma'afa, to me, when I look at the Ma'afa, it damaged African spiritual systems to where you have these traditional priests who are basically trying to give you readings for money and all types of negative, violent stuff that they do that we all know about that happens in Africa. So, like, we devolved, or we were degenerated from the genocide of the Ma'afa and the slave trade. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that Kimi and Kush are just the end all be all, because it's a specific period in time.
Right.
And we are an evolved form of those Africans. So we have to use objectivity, science, rationality to reconstruct a better ideal. And I'm gonna
it ain't gonna happen. It ain't happening. Let me just tell, it ain't happening. I was around when most of the stuff first started, right? So I came into the Department of Black Studies at City College in 1983. Then I I got glimpses of Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark. And by 85, we were preparing to go to Kemet. And then while we were preparing to go to Kemet, of course, we had the Chicago Institute, Dr. Jacob Carruthers Chicago Institute, right, of Kemetic Studies. And that's when I first started listening academically to the concepts of Nile Valley spirituality. Then among them were some of the precursors to the Kemetic shrines. They were around, and these are charismatic figures. A lot of them came from the arts and things like that. and they were very charismatic. They dressed it. They had oils. And then there was another group. There was Osiris Set, Raul Nefer, and I've been to a couple of his early, not early because he was earlier in the 70s, but in
Like
the
a
80s.
Rosicrucian.
Yeah, his form of mixing several different things, Eastern beliefs and Nile Valley. It was
Yeah.
kind of like a collage, and at that time, it seemed very beautiful, and there were some very beautiful people. And then, of course, then there was the Kemetic tradition that arose. But then I find, white earlier Europeans, they were part of this Kemetic tradition,
Kemetic
right?
Orthodoxy.
Yeah, and prior to that, Madame Blavatsky and all
Yeah,
these
Blavatsky.
people and these secret shrines of and so
Rosicrucian.
and yeah, but the Rosicrucians, for at least the Rosicrucians, I give them credit. They read the Meta Nature,
Right.
right? But then we got these groups of people that they was reading this book right here. I think this is the book.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, well, it's Budge. You know what I call these people? I call these people Dashiki Hindus. That's my name for them, Dashiki Hindus.
Yeah, don't lose. Listen, let me talk, Canby Verse. Don't lose any of your followers, right? Because if you talk, you're gonna lose your followers, right? So they're reading the Purdom Haru as if there's only one Purdom Haru. This was their Bible.
Man.
They didn't know that. There's at least 100 of these things, right? And they didn't know that Narcissus, like Hatshepsut, didn't have a Purdom Haru. She didn't have one. As far as they was concerned, every Egyptian had a Purdom Haru, and this was the Bible. And then they were mispronouncing words and not knowing that there's mistakes that Budge said that's clearly because they know how to read the Meta Nature. And then they're doing these elaborate performances. Did anybody see? I think Zeus saw when I was having an earlier conversation with Jabari. Did you see that, Zeus?
Yeah, I did.
What you think of that, Zeus?
I mean, it's case in point, It's case in point.
Like he went
But I love Jabari though. I love Jabari, and I guess that's what worries me though is that we might miss this opportunity to not be like these other groups that are already dogmatic.
Yeah.
That
are already set.
Nice one. I'm not worried about Brother Jabari. I'm worried about the people coming behind him.
Here's the issue that I see though, with a lot of this, right? The first, because even in relation to the UK, obviously the Osiris Society exists over here, and like it was Brother Richard was saying, beautiful people, right? And we have agreements and disagreements with them, and even me, like teaching what is referred to as yoga is if you knew me, a decade ago, you might be very surprised about that, right? And that is a challenge for me as well in terms of the philosophy that I try to bring to the practice and so on and so forth, and this whole New Age thing, because I'm not into the New Age thing, right? But at the same time, at the same time, one of the things that I've been involved in throughout my entire life because of the work of my organization is life cycle blessings. People, when children are born, and when people die and so on and so forth, rituals take place, right? And so there is an understanding of the fact that within our community, there is a need for us to have and develop ceremony that is in line with the life cycle. Okay, and so the work of one of the things that my organization does is life cycle blessings, and people want those, but they don't want them in a Christian or a Muslim setting and so on and so forth, right? And I think to the extent that African spiritual systems exist, and to the extent that people hearken to Kemet, I think that there's a caricature that has been created that is often overplayed. And I think that oftentimes when we talk about people that deal with Kemet and only deal with Kemet or deal with Kemet as an abstraction from the rest of Africa, those people exist. But I think that the extent to which those people exist is often exaggerated. Yeah, and we can use the example that's on the floor, Brother Jabari. Yeah, everybody knows him as Brother Jabari. Jabari is a Kiswahili name. Okay, Brother Jabari, 9 times out of 10, when he travels to Kemet, he also travels to Ghana. Yeah, so so we can hearken on the fact that we may agree. I have my disagreements with Brother Jabari, or sometimes a difference of emphasis with Brother Jabari, but to say that he deals with Kemet and not the rest of Africa would be manifestly false. Yeah, and so I think that we can disagree with him, we can challenge him without having to reinforce caricatures that are just not true. Do you know what I'm saying? I think that we should all be able to do that, and that is the issue that I have with a lot of these conversations. A lot of caricatures are put out there, and it retards an actual in-depth for more nuanced conversation around our development in these areas. I'll say one more thing. One of the things that, in relation to what Cam diversed a minute ago, in terms of the extent to which our spiritual traditions were perverted because of enslavement and colonialism, this is true. And I can say this especially as an African coming out of the diaspora experience, yeah, whereby a lot of our spiritual traditions evolved in the context of plantation slavery, yeah, and were banned and demonized. And because of the fact that they were banned formally and legally, a lot of the social order that would have existed around them was destroyed, yeah. And so a lot of aberrations, crop up in that kind of a context, right? This is a fact. At the same time, I think that there is a move and a development that is needed to hearken to and study the basic foundational philosophy within the spiritual systems and build from there, and also emphasize and study the extent to which this philosophy relates to political and economic issues. Yeah. So, for example, how our relationship to land, how we
But see, not to cut you off, brother, but just what you're saying now is kind of where all this comes from, I think. It's not just a repulsion to Africa that I'm talking about, but it's also, and I'm not at all putting Jabari in that, because I know that he goes to Ghana and everything, but that's also why I'm saying that this stuff is still new, but I think that going forward, it would be nice to see people focus more on some of the applied stuff. Like when I go into the literature and I read about Geru Ma'at, right? And these people that embody Ma'at, they embody Ma'at because they had social duties and they fulfilled those social duties, right?
100.
It's not just because the Neteru, you know what I'm saying?
100%. No, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and that's part of what I'm saying in terms of how things developed in the Caribbean, right? A lot of the social duties were destroyed because the social order was destroyed, yeah, and things have to move underground. So when you see a lot of caricatures about voodoo and obia, yeah, a lot of that is propaganda, but a lot of that is also based upon the context in which the systems were subjected to in the first place, right? But when you look into the deeper philosophy of it, you will see, for example, how the so-called maroon communities were developed around these principles, yeah. And I think that the more you study indigenous African spiritual systems, the more, like, it's impossible to understand the economics of Africa indigenously without appreciating yeah, the spiritual system, because oftentimes those values are given expression in the spiritual system, right? And so yeah, I do believe that there is a necessity to look at it on that level more than we look at it just in terms of anthropomorphization and things of that nature. You know what I'm saying? But I think this is all a stage in the process. I'm not too hard on our people because of where we're coming from, and there are just developmental stages that we have to go through. I
agree. People can't be too sensitive, because it's a crazy time.
Yeah, man.
But we need the flexibility to be able to change and have accountability.
Definitely.
Well,
Does
I'm the accountability. When it comes there are others like me or very similar, but there's like a Soren Ka. He's a priest. He's a hymn netcher. There's Smash Rockwell, who is how can I say a better expert in the language than me, and then there's people from Dr. Ricketti's school. My whole point of view, if you ain't reading the Meta Nature, then shut your Ross. If I could say it like that. Like if you can't read if you can't read a sentence, you're like irrelevant. And I just want to keep it a buck, right? So you're teaching people stuff that you can't show in the text, and so you might know the words, but you don't know the usage of the word. You don't know the text, and I'm not talking about Jabari. I'm talking about people in this so-called Kemetic tradition. They're doing this ceremony called the opening of the way, the Wawat, which is basically a funerary procession, and they're not being honest. They're saying in Nezarek, happy, in Nezarek, Kabesaneth, Duamatef, right? Those are the conical jars, right? Like those are the four sons of Horus. Like, don't bring that into your life. Like, it's not even an innovation. It's just dead wrong. Whoever created it is just out of their mind, right? It's a funerary procession. You don't start. You call it spirituality. You don't start at a ceremony. Like, do a libation to the ancestors. Don't start on a funerary thing, because when I hear it, it's like the opposite of music to the ears. It makes me go crazy, because I hear them trying to pronounce words and say words, and they don't know what they're talking about. They're actually bringing in the four sons of Horus. Like, I'm not spiritual, but I know I'm not spiritual, but I'm like, that's dead wrong.
does anybody remember when John Henrik Clarke gave a lecture where he talked about the role of Africans, the African spiritual system, and then like after the lecture, this kind of country looking white dude asked him, so he was like, do you want black people to go back to animism then? And I think he was kind of taken back by it, but I wished he would have answered the question in one word, and he would have just said institutionally, because from just my assessment, kind of being an outsider, like an alternative Pan-Africanist in some ways, I would say the most powerful thing that we can take from African spiritual system is just the abundance of deities and sciences associated with them, and the competence that it came with.
I agree.
I think that there's something to say there. One of my favorite scholars is a guy by the name of Kiateza Luka, and he speaks about systematic theology. The fact that a lot of people don't realize that what our ancestors created was a systematic theology. 100. And I wouldn't necessarily use the term animism, but more so if we read Obenga in African Philosophy of the Pharaonic Period, where he details there was a lack of a demarcation between so-called soft sciences like psychology and psychiatry, as opposed to hard sciences like chemistry and biology and engineering. That's what this was. It was basically our ancestors' way of interpreting reality. So what I'm more so interested in, and I do appreciate, even though I have my own personal thoughts about some of these reconstructions that we do see within the contemporary world.
Be cool, Ken.
I would be cool, because my parents were directly from Africa, and sometimes I look at that stuff and I'm like, it doesn't seem.
Don't call it stuff. Be cool, Ken.
I'm gonna be cool. I'm just saying that for me, I would say this. If we're gonna deal with reconstructing African spirituality, it should be centered within contemporary living African languages and traditions, because that's more practical, and we can use the classical period as kind of a blueprint to build off of, and make it better and refine it. But to me, it's more realistic if I can go to in Jamaica you call them Obeaman,
Yeah.
and we call them Lakwa, and some African, and Chedo could speak to this. You use a kind of derogatory term, Marobo, and they're more so mischievous. But
Mhm.
we have living traditions that though they were damaged a little bit, they're still here, and we shouldn't take them for granted. And it doesn't have to be a spookism. To me, as an engineer, it is literally the reconstruction of pre-colonial engineering systems.
One
To
hundred percent.
integrate
The
people.
opportunity is wide open because these are often marginalized communities where
Yeah.
they are because of the hegemony of foreign religions.
But
Right.
here's the thing, though, because my life again speaks to this. I was born and raised in an African spiritualist organization. I'm saying that did exactly what you're saying, Kamji. Yeah, looked into living traditions, right?
Yeah.
But
Before you go, Shakara, I just
go
want
on,
to say one thing.
go on.
To me, the standard, and even maybe even more than standard, and this might be pseudo, I don't know, but maybe through cultural inheritance, all Africans, I think, lean towards ancestral veneration. And I think that as a kind of umbrella understanding.
The central point. Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree. The issue that I have, though, again, is with overemphasis, right? There's a whole Ifa tradition, yeah, that exists within the African diaspora, yeah, that because a lot of these conversations center around the Sarnetaverse, so to speak, yeah, does not get taken into consideration, yeah. There are far more Africans involved in Isheshe than there are involved in Kemet, in the diaspora, yeah, involved in the Neteru traditions. It just so happens that a lot of the online discussion takes place with people that are dealing with the Neteru traditions, right?
Yeah.
Um, so if we're dealing with the real world and the actual condition of African people, then we'll find that people are going to Haiti and Cuba and Brazil, yes,
Yeah.
for their initiations, and they're not dealing with Neteru in those places, yeah.
Yeah.
That's one element of it. The second element of it is that we've just had a presentation on connections between the Nile Valley and West Africa.
Yeah.
Yes. And so the concept of the cultural unity of Black Africa means that people are going to find, if they're dealing with the spiritual systems, ways of expressing that. Yes.
Hmm.
And making that cultural unity not just a theoretical exercise, but a living tradition. Yeah.
Yeah.
For example, every first Sunday in the month, we have our ritual as the Al Qaeda Revivalist movement, yeah?
Yeah.
And there's a section of it where we give honor to the different pantheons of divinities coming out of our indigenous spiritual systems. So we'll mention the Neteru, we'll mention the Orisha, we'll mention the Vodan or the Loa, yeah, and bring them. But the ritual is about cultural unity, right? So we're
Yeah.
bringing all of our traditions together and emphasizing them within this specific ritual as to emphasize this idea of cultural unity. Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's just one way in which people make the political kind of aim or trajectory living a living tradition within their spiritual system. And I just think that's just part of the process. You know what I'm
Well,
saying?
No,
I'm
definitely.
gonna say good night. It's 3:37 in the morning for me. My last words on the subject is Kennedy Versi did an incredible. We had talked about seeing if I can re-air this on the platform.
Sure.
What you should do is go into YouTube editor once it's live
Uh
and take out all this other stuff, right?
huh. Yeah.
Take out, just edit it all out. It's just not important to the work that you was doing. Look, people are doing a lot of innovations, right? I have deep respect for African traditions, uh, and and those people who are interested in that, that's fine. It takes a long time for people to move up in the ranks and to do what they do within those things. I respect that process. I have a problem with the innovation in Kemet because I don't think that most of them, again, one is not connected to the rest of Africa. They try to change things. They don't want to deal with things like human sacrifice and some of the other rituals that they do. Right? They don't know the language. They don't know how to read. They certainly can't write. Right? Uh, they're not academic. They're not scholarly. They might be good people, but it's not right. It's just not correct. And that's all I want to say. But hopefully you do what I say, Cam Diverse. Go to the point when you open up the lines, and once we move off this point, cut it all out. Because it's just I just think that it doesn't help your presentation that you did today, which was just strictly scholarly. All of the spiritual stuff, that's not what you was talking about. Good night.
Good night, Reg.
Later.
So it's actually kind of a little bit late for me as well. So, just on that point, I just want to clarify some things. Like, I'm totally in favor of any African person who wants to, reconstruct, pre-colonial spiritualities for the contemporary time. I'm more so connected with science and engineering. I come from, like, in my own personal family, there's a lot of different individuals who are well known for that, well known for, creating syncretic forms of traditional belief systems. And to me, as long as if it develops our civilization, it's something that we could consider. Like, despite, some of the other things that I'll just keep to myself about the things that I disagree with. But I do think that all African people deserve space, just to try things out, try whatever works and, whatever is sufficient, whatever is like progressive and for our advancement. And if it leads to liberation, there's no way that I could be against that. So that's what I'll say on that.
But the funny thing is that if the more I study these things here, like, for example, the Iron Age, in Africa, can you fully appreciate that divorce from the spiritual system?
Nothing in Africa divorced from spiritualism can be appreciated.
And I'm only emphasizing the iron thing because of the engineering aspect, right?
Yeah.
That whole spiritual systems are developed in and around, and social orders are developed in and around this idea of blacksmiths and iron smelting and so on and so forth, right? So it's just something that we have to engage from whatever perspective that we engage it, scholarly or otherwise. It's just something that we have to engage to understand these things on a certain level. But again, I want to emphasize the fact that people are choosing what to focus on. Yeah. Do you see what I'm saying? It's not as though the Neteru people are even the majority.
They're not. And I don't even think it's a problem, to the extent that if it was rooted in scholarship and if it was rooted in like a diachronic analysis, I wouldn't have a problem with it. My main problem with it is just like certain things that I see. Like, I think yoga, you can maybe argue in between the Asivaha tradition of the Dravidians and, the Indo-Aryans. You could make an argument that is actually related to Paleo-Africans. But certain other traditions, like when you're talking about like karma and dharma and chakras and all that,
I totally agree. I absolutely agree, my brother. Yeah. And again, that's a specific challenge that I have teaching what I teach, right? And I have my own, contradictions where that is concerned and whatever, right? And so I try to teach it in a way that doesn't do those things. So like expressly, just this what I'm saying. Like, I'm not interested in trying to find an African equivalent to everything that happens in India and China. I'm not interested in that. I prefer to look at indigenous and to be fair, teaching this gives me an opportunity to do that in a way that people are open to what I'm saying because of what I teach, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So I do fully appreciate that. My only thing is that we have to be conscious of what we are choosing to breathe life into as far as a debate. And I actually think that there is room. And what you just said in terms of the lack of scholarship, it's a valid critique, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I don't have a problem with those with those critiques. Like, but if you're gonna make those critiques and then act like that is the majority of the thing, then I've got a problem with that, because you're just not taking into consideration the breadth of what is being done.
Yeah, and that's pretty much my thing, because it comes back to the same argument, right? About structure. People are leaving religion, or at least, modern religions, and come to these African traditions thinking there's no structure and these kinds of things like that. And people who have a lot of criticisms, in my opinion, and who are knowledgeable, actually have a responsibility, if that is what they're spearheading, you feel me? But like I said, it's new, man. It's new, and a lot of things are happening in the French community. The comedic thing is pretty strong,
100%, man. And I'm like, I feel like, for example, Baba Kim Wandin de Kiabon Sekifukia. There's no way you're gonna read him and just come away with spookism.
Right? There's a lot of people who can't stand him in the English speaking YouTube space.
Yeah, I get it. I get it. It's a challenge, because they want to paint everything as spookism, and he makes it very difficult to do that, right? Just what I'm saying is he makes it very difficult for you to just paint what he's saying as spookism.
Yeah, even in the comedic literature itself, you're not going to find a word for belief. You're not going to find a word for religion, and the equivalent to that is, rech nature. So that's to know God,
Right.
And what is God? It could be yourself. Well, at least what is nature? It could be yourself, nature, all these different kinds of things.
Yeah,
100.
So and even Senegal is an interesting case, because Senegal is so much more orthodoxly Muslim, even though it's not an Orthodox Muslim country. It's more strictly Muslim than a lot of other countries. So seeing this movement brush up against Senegal is very interesting right now. Bringing up a lot of conversations, a lot of contradictions. Because a lot of these things are still very real on the ground. So
yeah, no, I appreciate it. Bro, Captain Jivas, I just want to say, I think we should challenge our brothers and sisters to be more real with the thing. Like, for example, you take a brother like Asa Imhotep,
yeah,
he would deal with Kemet, right? But he will also deal with a lot of other Africa. Yeah. Now, if the audience only engages him on Kemet, then that's not on him.
Sure.
Right. This is what I'm saying, right? That's not a problem with what he's presenting. It's a problem with what you've chosen to engage him on, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I have my own, personal opinion just from what I've seen. I'm not going to speak negatively about Asar here. I'll just say that some of his linguistic analysis does not pass the smell test, especially when you deal with like the conventional methods of historical comparative linguistics. A lot of his theories are interesting, but like, to me, I want to see if he can pass the smell test when it comes to PhD linguist and peer-reviewed papers. To me, I haven't seen that. I've seen him publish in other areas, and I think that a lot of his criticism is because of the controversy of him, using giants like Mubabingi Bilolo and Lamb and Nasir Sar, and then because the people who agree with him,
the Kemet argument, I think, really did it.
Say it again.
That Kemet argument also really did it.
Yeah, the whole that riparian stuff to me is.
I see validity. I see validity in a lot of it, but see, for me, I'm very selfish. Like I'm very focused on what I'm focused on. I'm not looking to do an assessment of Asar's work. I'm looking for specific things. Certain things I agree with, certain things I don't, certain things I'm not even that well informed or interested, honestly.
Same.
Yeah, I think he means. I've spoken to him. He's a nice guy. I think he means well. Like, he wants to see people. He wants to see Africa progress. But to me, when he acts as if his analysis is superior to, giants like Diop and Obenga, for me, in my personal opinion, that's disrespectful to their legacy, because you're talking about guys. If you want to say that you're better than people who have universities with whole departments in their name. And in terms of your analysis, you haven't really submitted to a journal. I'm side-eyeing that because I'm like, if you took that to the continent and you tried to play that game, the continent, we respect our elders tremendously, and a lot of that stuff would not pass.
Here's where I appreciate.
But it's also like go ahead, Shaka.
That's not finish.
No, I was just gonna say, this conscious community breeds a certain kind of, if not behavior, definitely a record, But like you said, man, like respecting the elders is a big thing, and I think he knew that throwing that out there was going to be controversial.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, like a lot of these people that get online and do linguistics, a lot of it is very boastful. A lot of it is very, well, not even boastful, but it's like, this is what it is,
Most people are stuck on the Greenberg plantation. Like most people, when they're talking about linguistics, they're not even engaged in like contemporary, like post 66 historical comparative linguistics.
It's like for me, I try to take it easy because knowing Wolof, having grown up speaking Wolof, and having multiple Wolof dictionaries and read journals, there are a lot of terms that are not even in the majority of these dictionaries.
Yeah,
these dictionaries are not produced for Wolof speakers.
Yeah, and that's the thing though, because I think one of the values of Asar is a lot of the challenges to Greenberg were not in the English speaking world. A lot of that was the French speaking African world.
Yeah,
from an African point of view, yeah.
Yeah.
And so some of the French speaking, like I was exposed to some French speaking scholars by Brother Robin Walker, author of When We Ruled, one of my teachers, yeah.
Yeah.
But he doesn't speak French, right, or read French in that kind of way. And so, but him, Brother Asar, and so on have exposed me to a lot of the French speaking scholars who are doing this work, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
It's not even about whether I agree with Asar or not. It's about the exposure to the conversation, that is taking place. And from what I've seen of the brother, he tends to engage the conversation with the people that disagree with him, like in the sense of he's in contact with them, right?
Yeah.
And he will speak to correspondences between and so on. So I have my disagreements with him. I've challenged him as well on the elders front. I think he's cleaned a lot of that up in terms of how he presents the argument. I don't believe that we need to treat the scholarship of our elders as though it's not subject to updating. Right, I think it certainly is. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that many of them, including Diop, would welcome that, right?
They would
to a certain degree. So yeah, I agree that we need to have respect for the elders and things. But I think that there's a process that is taking place at the moment, which I think is valuable in terms of the communication between Africans in the French-speaking world and the English-speaking world on a scholastic basis.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I will say that the exposure itself is positive. There is a negative that, and if you listen to, and I think all of you here listen to the debate about Afro-Asiatic, right? Yeah. That I had on Smash's channel, where, Ankh was basically acting as if Negro Egyptian, the concept of Negro Egyptian or Paleo-African, has been completely debunked solely because of his disagreement with Asar. The problem with that is that he heard Asar reference scholars in different African countries, but never read the literature. Now, that's not necessarily Asar's fault that, he didn't necessarily present the full detail of Diong's argument or Diop's argument or Dika Aqua's argument or Lamb's argument or Sandro Capocici's argument, all of which are African linguists, but they diverge on various particular things with phonological and morphological reconstruction. And it's a more complicated conversation. But because those guys, those brothers only saw Asar's information and they don't view Asar as valid, that gave them the gall to paint the entire field as invalid. And to me, I'm like, nah, that's just like
that was crazy. Right. That was really crazy to me, honestly. Because especially you, Camji Verse, coming from Cameroon,
Yeah.
You know, there's a big Egyptology program over there. You have people like Umdigi, you know,
Huge.
people who are very, very well respected.
Yeah.
You know, um, it's out of sight, out of mind. You know what I mean? And that's got to change because that's also a form of isolationism.
Yeah.
You know, and
Mhm.
it's not fair to the other African scholars for sure. But I guess, you know, people like you and myself, Shakarad, others, like you said, you know, need to bring out that exposure and build these links, you know,
Mm.
because there's a lot of info out there. Every day I'm finding out stuff like there. You have white PhDs who are talking about migrations,
Yeah.
about deities like Osiris and Seth in the Senegambia, the Uraeus in the Niger. You know, so like it's not just this blackology kind of thing that
No.
people want to paint it as. You know, like I said, God, that is a central Wolof. You can't be Wolof without God. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So for a person of Wolof ancestry to know that and then look into the uh, literary text and see that same concept 2,600 years ago, you know, that's to me that's significant. You know?
What would be? And I know you want to wrap up, Kamji. So
Yeah, I do for sure.
tell me when you're ready. But there's a
This
question.
after this.
What would be your perspective, both of y'all, Kamji and Zoo, on Diop's attempts at reconstruction between Kemet and Wolof?
Oh, man.
Morphologically, it's on point. Phonologically, there's some mistakes that he made.
I could agree with that generally, you know, and even Job, you know, really stressed that, you know, he's just bringing what he can bring as one human being,
Yes.
Mhm.
you know, and the work he brought out, you know, a lot of times is downplayed, but even at the conference, you know, you have cats like Sonoron who said that
Valid field of inquiry.
yeah, you know, it's a valid fear of inquiry. If you are
Yep.
finding
Mm.
third person, masculine, feminine, singular in the
Mhm.
same language and all these other find me a Semitic language where you can find all of these other
Well,
conjugations.
you won't. It's impossible.
Right.
Obenga built upon like Diop was one scholar. You have descendants in the
Of course.
Diopian school of linguistics like Gilbert and Ngom and Obenga. And Ngom established a diachronic of relationship between Sawa in Cameroon and Met Kimi, and he helped Diop a little bit with his phonological analysis in connecting Wolof to Sawa or Douala. So even though Diop did make errors, as if every linguist makes errors, you
Mhm.
have Diang and people who came after him, Musa Lam, who's coming after him, Sancho Capochichi, who a lot of people sleep on. So African linguistics has evolved since that point, despite the fact that there were errors. He laid a good foundation for what we're doing now.
And I
100.
think and I think you know part of the gap we're seeing is a you know academia likes to play the ignore game. You know what I mean? So that can easily turn people into seeming pseudo to people who just want to look at surface stuff. You
Mm.
know, these are also places that just like the United States just got out of colonialism,
Yes, sir.
you know.
Yes, sir.
And so people are more interested in other fields that may be more rewarding, you know.
White people, I mean,
I,
they're
I
never.
was I was gonna make that point about the ignore game
Yeah.
with Sumer and its relationships with Niger Congo. How like everybody's
Oh
done that
man,
for the last 80 years, but it's not one word about that on
that's a
Wikipedia.
rabbit hole. That is a deep rabbit hole.
So
I
like
mean,
that's when I'm like, where does Asar get his peer review? Because it's not going to be from anything that's published in Wikipedia,
yeah. I mean, when you're dealing
and
with a
that's
linguist,
Wikipedia.
But but Asari is not the author of that theory, though.
it's a.
No, I
what's it
mean,
called?
I mean, like just
Crap. I'm
that
forgetting.
that like that pool of people that are available to do something that would be cited in Wikipedia is so tight that it doesn't include people that come, way before us are.
But do you know what the problem with that theory is? Is the fact that Sumerian is a language isolate. So you can't really you can't compare a language isolate to what would be a hypothetical reconstruction in Proto-Bantu or Proto-Niger-Congo. Like methodologically, it would be impossible to establish diachronic sound correspondences because you don't have that value in the ancient language being Sumerian, and then Bantu hasn't been fully reconstructed. So on both ends, it's an error.
But correct me if I'm wrong. Reading the work of Fari Supia, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but isn't part of the argument challenging or questioning the idea that it is an actual isolate?
Yeah,
right? But Egyptian, for instance, is supposed to be an isolate, but so Chadic has over 50 languages now.
Yeah.
But the only languages they can cite for Egyptian is Old, Middle, and Coptic, and these different stages of the same language.
That wouldn't be the same definition
because you have stuff like Segerer, who's starting to point out that Wolof, which they thought was genetically related to these other languages, is now also a isolate.
In so-called Niger Kordofanian.
So. Yeah. Things are starting to open up in a certain way because these models that they have, and that's the thing, people have to understand that these are models. They're not set in stone. They're ways to explain the data.
Not at all. Greenberg is actually, to me, if you're using Greenberg, you're like a super pseudo. He can be used contemporaneously if you want to compare typological items between languages, but to use Nilo-Saharan, Afro-Asiatic, Niger-Congo, Bontoid, Congoid, as if these are legitimate historical populations, to me is the height of insanity and the height of linguistic illiteracy.
Yeah.
On the political level, those same distinctions are being used to create even like racial distinctions.
Oh, yeah, it's so crazy. Like these Somali trolls and all these people. Yeah, we're Congoid, we're Bontoid. It's like,
it's a mad. It's a mad.
And how come everybody, all of them get Fulani's language wrong?
Say it one more time.
Like all of them seem to think the Fulani speak an Afro-Asiatic language.
Yeah, they're crazy. Like Fulani, even in Greenbergian, is Atlantic, which is Nigero-Kordofanian. But Lamb destroyed them. Like in Lamb's analysis of Fulani with Metrem and Kimi, right, or an ancient Egyptian, he killed them archaeologically and linguistically. So like the fact that from Diop's morphological analysis, morphology from Wolof to Metrem and Kimi, that's a quote-unquote so-called Afro-Asiatic and the so-called Nigero-Kordofanian.
Right. That's the question that I ask people just to be, kind of facetious. I'm like, so is Wolof an Afro-Asiatic language that formed itself in the Niger Kordofanian environment, or is Egyptian something that we have to reevaluate?
I would say
way you gotta, you gotta do something.
Yeah. So let's close off because we've been on here for a little over 3. So let's start with 42. Give your last statements about the presentation and this combo.
I missed a lot of the presentation, so you can take Reggie's advice. I think it's good advice, but can you wait a few days so we can watch it?
Yeah, I'll wait a few days. It up. And I've never actually spliced anything up, so I'm gonna have to go back into it and.
Well, I would think maybe just divide this conversation from the presentation.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
And then maybe make some shorts.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I'm actually so behind on some of my content about some of the stuff that I did in the past. I got to cut that up into shorts. And I also have some interviews that I've been doing in the background. I just have to sit down and edit those out and release them. But it's some pretty, high power content.
All right. But besides that, thanks for having me there. I wanted to get deeper into how you classify ancient populations as archaic, but I'm going to watch the presentation and then we can hit that later.
Yeah, so, definitely. All right, let's go with peace. Let's go with our Wolof brother, Zuchedo.
Yo. Man, I just want to say, thanks for the presentation. It was a great presentation. Felt like I soaked up a lot. I'll probably go back to it also.
Yeah.
And I hope that I didn't come off as somebody who hates religious people and religion. But I just hope that we plug ourselves more into more practical things and more right now things, including back to the continent, Big up to Shakara, big up to everybody.
Yes, sir.
And Yarama, Jaringen Duf. Peace out,
Peace.
Peace. Yeah, man. Just thanking you again for the presentation, my brother. It's added a lot to my understanding of this particular topic, to which I am a student, an absolute student. I would love, speaking of brother Asar, because he has a couple presentations on the same subject.
Yeah.
So there's definitely room for some dialogue there that I think would be beneficial to the community. So I'd love for that to take place, because there's on this particular issue, it seems that you have a lot of similarities, but also your differences would be also educational. Yeah, so I look forward to that if and when that particular thing takes place. And I just want to say, because I am Shakara and I have to play on the political implications of all of this, that the fight against this connection is a political one.
Yes, it is
designed to facilitate a lack of cohesiveness between African people, as much as our ancestors who affirmed this particular connection did so, one, on a scholastic basis, but also politically speaking, as Diop said, to find the cohesive elements that contributed to the stabilization of African societies. And so you're adding to our knowledge on that subject, and I appreciate it, especially because you're coming from Cameroon. And that's important as well. The Africans on the continent are involved in these conversations as well, so once again, give thanks. You're doing the ancestors well, my brother, so we appreciate you. Peace.
Appreciate you too, bro. Peace. So thank you all for showing up and showing out for me. This has been a great conversation. And, we went over some of the connections of West African historical populations. Just the fact that, in different chronological periods, you don't necessarily have continuity between, say, early Stone Age populations to middle Stone Age populations to late Stone Age populations to the agro-pastoralists of the contemporary period. So we went into all that, and we discussed some phylogenetic analysis as well as architectonics to discuss the evolution of material cultures using prototypes in these classical Happy River Valley civilizations and their evolutionary derivations that we find in West Africa. So, scroll back and listen to the convo, catch the replay. It's definitely well worth the wait and the listen. And with that, peace, and thank you all for listening.